My grandfather always filled the ice bucket whenever he stayed at a motel. I recently learned why. Back when my parents were trying to make it work, back when they had their weekly meetings to help try and get along, before the separate apartments and holidays, and well before the divorce dust had all settled, my parents sent me to stay with my grandpa for the summer. He was a quiet man, my grandpa, and this kept me from being closer to him than I ought to have, especially since I was his only grandson. So, when I discovered I'd have to spend an extended stretch of summer with him, I was less than thrilled. Everything distills down to a single week in July. That week, we were spending a lot of time in cemeteries all across northwestern Arkansas and parts of Missouri, taking winding roads through the back corners of the Ozark Mountains. At the time, with my 12-year-old frame of reference, I thought maybe we were doing this because Grandpa was close to the grave himself. Grandma had died a couple years earlier after all. But looking back and doing the math, that couldn't have been it. He had quite a ways to go still. What we were doing was chasing ghosts. More or less. Remnants of ancestors. We'd pull into a graveyard in the middle of nowhere, markers 100 years old, and he'd pull out his little notebook, thumb through the pages. Then he'd step out and with his hands on his hips give the plot of land a good look-see, really survey the place. That's not it, he'd mutter to himself, then get his bearings again. We would crisscross the rows of graves until he found the desired headstone. Then he'd pull out a piece of butcher paper and a disc of black rubbing wax. Using these tools, he'd make a rubbing of the grave, the imperfections and engravings etched onto the paper. This whole journey wasn't exactly my idea of a good time. I yearned for my usual summer routine of sleepovers, swimming pools, bicycles, fireworks, and movies with friends. But I tried to be on my best behavior and act gracious, even though I was quietly going insane with boredom. After stopping at a couple more nondescript cemeteries, we found ourselves at the end of the day. We headed back east, the blue evening and the twilight haze and the disappearing sun at our backs. Gonna find us a place to stop off for the night. It would be our 5th overnight of the trip. I had lucked out once, and only once, when we found a place with a swimming pool, but it was near the interstate. That perk seemed unlikely out here in the country, running through small towns on 2-lane highways. We pulled up to a joint called the Huckleberry Inn, a park by the door motel with a couple strips of single-story rooms all in a row. It looked plenty vacant. I waited in the car while Grandpa went to the front office and paid for a room. He returned to the car with a keychain, and we crept around to our room, unloaded our luggage. I belly flopped onto the bed. The stiff comforter felt like dead skin and the mattress was lumpy. I found the remote to the TV and flicked through some channels. I wanted to watch MTV or Nickelodeon or something, but I felt too self-conscious to watch something like that with my grandpa here. Instead, I left it on an episode of Bonanza while I took a comic book to the bathroom for a bit. After I finished, I wandered off outside to find my grandpa. He was just standing in the parking lot, staring out into the dark and smoking a cigarette. He heard me come up behind him, turned to me. "You get the ice?" "Not yet," I said. It had become a ritual. No matter where we stopped on this trip, there was always a bucket of ice that we filled from the motel ice machines. It didn't matter if neither of us opened the individually wrapped plastic cups and helped us to a glass of tap water on the rocks. It didn't matter if we just had dinner and weren't thirsty. No matter the situation, we had to fill the little plastic tub full of ice and leave it on the plastic tray atop the dresser until morning came, until it was nothing but a flimsy bag of cold water. I headed to where the ice and vending machines were, in a little alcove between the rooms and the motel office. The Pepsi machine gave off an ethereal glow. I pressed all the buttons and checked the change slot. Such habits could yield treasures like a free soda or 50 cents, but I came up empty that night. The ice machine whirred and groaned as I tried to get it to dispense. I bumped it with my shoulder, looked up into the little dispenser hole, even snaked my hand up there to see if I could feel the cold. Nothing. I shrugged and went back to the room with an empty bucket. Grandpa was lying on his back with his shoes off, twitching his toes through his socks. His eyes were half closed. I set the empty ice bucket down. Get filled up? He asked. Nah. Machine was busted. He sat up with a start. What? So, there's no ice? Was there another machine? He swung his legs off the bed and started lacing up his boots. I don't think so. I didn't see what the big deal was. I'd never seen him rise above his emotionally flat baseline, and here he was getting worried about ice. Come on, let's go see, he said. We did a perimeter sweep of the property, just a boy and his grandpa and a plastic bucket. His pace quickened the further we went. You wouldn't say his behavior was frantic if you saw him, but knowing him, that was the word that came to mind. His version of frantic was anybody else's calm mood. At the front office, we rang the service bell, rousing the owner from some back room. The overhead lights glinted off of her glasses as she greeted us with sleepy eyes and a tired smile. Excuse me. Y'all's ice machine's broke. You got another somewhere? No, I'm sorry. Supposed to have a repairman look at it next week. But I guess that don't help you now. There was a sympathetic smile. Fake. You got anything in the back? Grandpa asked, looking over her shoulder. No, unfortunately, she said with a little frown that tried to cover up the fact that she couldn't care less whether we had ice tonight. There a convenience store around here? Grandpa's mouth got smaller by a few millimeters. Up the road. But oh wait. What time is it? No, they're closed. I'm really sorry to inconvenience you folks like this. Grandpa made a little clicking noise. We're gonna head out. Any way we can get a refund? On account of the ice machine? Geez, you fellas must really like ice. I don't know if I can do that. Did y'all step foot in the room? Lie on the beds? It's not like there's a sign out front that says ice guaranteed. Look, we didn't even. Whatever. Forget it. Keep it. Come on, Daniel, he said halfway out the door. I could only glance back at the front desk lady's perplexed face. Grandpa was already halfway across the parking lot, marching with purpose. Here ya go, I said, handing the front desk lady the plastic ice bucket. Look, you guys ever come back through? I promise we'll have it fixed. We've been trying to get the guy in here for weeks. I only shrugged and jogged after Grandpa. Get your bag. We gotta get out of here. It's important. He had already loaded his small suitcase in the trunk, and I went and grabbed mine. I had a nervous feeling in my stomach. For the life of me, I didn't know what was going on. I had never seen him the slightest bit rattled, but there he was. Rattled. But I had forgotten my comic in the restroom. I went back to grab it and pondered taking a leak for the road. God damn it, Daniel, hurry up. Grandpa yelled from the doorway. I had never heard him curse before, and he had never yelled at me either. My body flushed with shame and anger, and I ducked my head and sat in the front seat of the Sable, comic book in hand. He peeled out of the parking lot, and we drove off in a haste. Whatever he thought was chasing us was still out there in the night. I didn't talk, and he didn't talk. Still feeling like a scolded puppy from him, yelling at me, and anger simmered underneath and took over. My wounded pride took precedence over the burning questions I had. Primarily, just what in the hell was going on? There was close to an hour of driving, the forest around us frightening and imposing in the dark, like it was something that wasn't meant to be traversed at this hour. It triggered a primal fear. The fear was this: There were things out here that could kill you. Things that could drag you kicking and screaming out into the dark, never to be heard from again. Things that we had largely taken dominion over with guns and fire and electricity and extinction, but the fear remained. We chanced upon a state rest stop. It was a mere pull-off parallel to the highway with a couple of 55-gallon drums and a picnic table or two. Grandpa pulled over. "This'll do just fine," he said. "What are we doing?" I asked. "Pulling off for the night. You can sleep in the back seat. Could bundle up a towel for a pillow. I've got a blanket in the trunk, but why? What was wrong with the motel?" "They didn't have any ice," he said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. He yawned like a cartoon character, stretched his arms as far as he could. "Look, little buddy, we better hit the hay while we can. Got a lot more miles to cover tomorrow. I'll be fine sleeping up front." That was that. I sulked and curled down low in the back seat until sleep took hold. I awoke to bird song in the morning, shafts of sunlight shining through the trees. My jeans were balled upon the floor, and for a moment I thought I had pissed myself, but it was just my briefs soaked with the sweat from sleeping in a vehicle on a humid summer night. Grandpa wasn't in the front seat. I shimmied into my jeans and stepped outside. He was sitting on one of the picnic tables. "Morning sunshine," Grandpa said, acting like I had just emerged in the kitchen on a Sunday morning while he manned the waffle maker, ignoring the fact we were on the side of the road after fleeing into the night. Still half asleep, I grumbled a response. The surroundings and circumstance disoriented me. "Reckon we better head on down the road a bit and find us a bite to eat?" he asked. "I guess," I said. "Look, why did we sleep on the side of the road? What was all of that about? With leaving the motel?" "My neck hurts from sleeping in the back," he sighed. "It's a long story, son. I don't really want to get into it right now. We'll just make sure that every hotel has an ice machine from here on out, okay? No more sleeping on the side of the roads. I'll tell you someday when you're older." And he did tell me when I was older, but not until I was much older, not until that night we fled the motel was a distant memory, not until he had passed away. I wasn't close to him when I was forced to take upon that venture, that quest across the southeastern United States where we scoured graveyards for proof of lives once lived, links in the chain. Yet that trip brought us closer together, and we would grow even closer still, him becoming a father figure. After the divorce, my mom would move us out to his town 3 hours away, where I would stay until I graduated high school. I made it to my 30s before he got sick. As a smoker that hadn't quit until later in life, he had a pretty good run before something related to that got to him. In his case, it was lung cancer. They thought they had caught it early enough that they liked his chances if he did chemo. He was in his 70s and still seemed as full of life as ever, like he could get a decade or more if he beat it. However, he was reluctant to start the treatment. "I'm only doing this because your mom wants me to fight it, or whatever. I just take my chances if it was up to me. I feel about done. Like I'm ready to go see your grandma," he told me. I was married and out of state at this point, making trips home when I could, because I was worried the end could be near, and you never really know. The treatment for his cancer had been a series of forward steps and backward slides, all amounting to little more than tires spinning in the mud. It was near the end of his life when I received an email from him. This came as a surprise, as he seldom sent emails. He'd always been resistant to newfangled technology, finally acquiescing to us purchasing him a tablet with a keyboard. I'm lucky I received his email when I did. By the time I finished it, I told my work there was an emergency, hopped in my car, and urgently drove back to my grandfather's hometown. "Daniel, I guess I've got to get this out somehow, and you're the only one that would really understand." You may remember that summer trip we took back when your folks were having problems, back before they split up. Remember that night we slept in the car because the motel ice machine was broken? I remember the trip clearly. Most days, I was still sad and angry over your grandmother being gone. I didn't do much of the things I used to. I didn't go to church or fish or go to breakfast on the weekends. I just work and come home and sit around that empty house. So it was good for you to come out on that trip with me. Got me out of a funk, I suppose. I know I ain't the most outgoing sort of fella, never been one to show how I feel very much, but I was glad you were there. Now what I'm about to tell you, I would have never taken you along if I didn't think it would be safe. It had been years, decades even since these events took place. Your grandma and I had traveled tons of times after, and as long as I did what I was supposed to, I was fine. It had been a few years since we had gotten back from the war, and we had settled into our lives back home. College was never in the works for me, so my GI Bill was never used. I hadn't proposed to your grandmother yet, but we were in the courtship phase. Shane Albright had served over there with me. He came to tell me about some work with the U.S. Forest Service. Said there were hiring preferences for veterans on account of it being a government job and all. So we both signed on and got jobs with the Fire Watch. They had us working near our hometown at first, but soon they shuffled us around, doing month-long stints at sites across state lines. These out-of-town gigs paid a little more. We'd ride out together in Shane's Studebaker Champion, where we would arrive at the site and be stationed at separate towers, staring out across the rolling forests as we looked for fires. Then we were off for 2 weeks before we'd go back and do it again. It was solitary work. I sometimes wonder if working the job made me quieter than I already was. I got in the habit of journaling, writing letters to the gal that would become your grandma, little love poems she kept in an envelope. They are buried under the earth with her. Sometimes it would take us a 2-day drive out to these towers. We'd end up staying overnight somewhere along the way. Other times, we'd get off on that Sunday and drive all the way through, taking shifts behind the wheel, collapsing back at home in piles of pure exhaustion, with little memory of how we got there. It was on one of these overnights when we heard it. The broadcast. I was driving, and the AM radio was going when suddenly a lady with the voice of an angel sang Anchors Our Way. Shane was half asleep in the passenger seat, but started singing along to it. There was a burst of static and the sounds of explosions, the howl of klaxons and the shots of an ack-ack gun, and someone whistling happily through it all. Then there was a masculine voice, a cheerful voice. He introduced himself as Buck Hensley and started rambling about the pilot of the Enola Gay and how he never lost a wink of sleep, even after what he'd done. Vaporized all those men, women and children, and babies of Hiroshima. Said that maybe nuking a city worked better than a nightcap or a glass of warm milk as far as a sleep remedy. He said that he found the whole thing hilarious and pitiful from the outside looking in, especially knowing what he knew now. Now, at this point, Shane was sitting straight up in his seat. We were both enraptured by what we were hearing. The man on the radio then presented us with something he called the rules of the road. The rule was this: if we were to stop at a motel or hotel at any point during our journey, then we were to request ice for our room from the innkeepers. He said there might even be an ice machine on the premises, that they would one day be all the rage at lodgings in the future. And he was right, but that's beside the point. It would be clear that there was something uncanny about the guy on the radio well before his prediction came true. The consequences of not following this rule seemed vague. He said something about a visitor in the night that would give us cold feet. The man on the radio, Buck Hensley, he bid us a fond farewell and safe travels, and just like that, the radio went back to normal. To cut to the chase, we were on the road once again, driving out to a job. We had stopped off at some roadside motel, not unlike the many and I stayed at during our cemetery trip, just newer and less worse for wear. It was late when we stopped. There wasn't a TV in the room. Those were luxury items at that point, only a radio on the dresser. I remembered the warning. "You really gonna do that?" Shane asked me. "Sure. Why not? The ice ain't free. I could use me a cold drink. They gave me a small ice bucket at the motel office. It cost 5 cents. Well, if you've got it, might as well make the most of it," Shane said, and pulled a pint of rye whiskey from his bag. He had a drink, and I had one as well. "Betcha didn't know your old pops had it in him." That was then, though. I put aside all of that tomfoolery once your mom was born. So that's how we all survived our first night at a motel after hearing that fateful rule. We rode off to our job site for another couple weeks of fire watching and isolation. There was a late departure, and we found ourselves bone-tired and miles from home. Even if we had pulled it together and drove in shifts, we wouldn't have gotten back home until noon. Shane asked, why not take it easy and stop for a bite, maybe get a drink? There was a little town with a diner and a motel and a filling station. We had burgers and sodas and fries at the diner. It was getting late by the time we got into our room, and I wanted nothing more than to fall asleep. Shane had other ideas, though. He had eyed a pool hall off the main drag and wanted to go, begging me to come along with him. I shrugged and followed along. We played some pool and drank some beers. As the night rolled on, Shane got cozy with a gal in a corner booth. I was on the sideline and getting bored. I made a signal to Shane that I'd be leaving. He pulled me aside. "Look, pal, I play my cards right. We might find ourselves back at the room," he said with a wink. "Just wanted to give you a heads up." I just sighed and told him good luck, and when I got to the room, I realized we only had a single bed. Being in the military, it was nothing for us to sleep in proximity like this. However, if he brought a girl back to the room, that might have made things complicated. I didn't really want to be in there, even if there were two beds. It was decision time, and as welcoming as the bed looked to my drunk and tired body, I took one for the team. I made my way to the car and fell asleep in the back seat of the Studebaker. The sleep was light and fitful. I tossed and turned in and out of a half-awake doze, my thoughts growing more agitated at my sleeping situation, when all of a sudden it hit me. The ice. We had forgotten the ice. I shot up and opened the door. I didn't know what time it was. It was still dark out. The parking lot was silent. I started for the motel room door. My hand was almost to the knob when the door creaked open and someone stepped out. Was it the same gal from the bar? She looked different in the orange motel lights. Like her skin was pallor. Her eyes were the bluest things I'd ever seen. Glowing almost. She smiled at me and her lips looked like they had a layer of frost on them. "Care for a turn?" "Your buddy's tuckered out," she said. That's when I noticed her blouse was unbuttoned. I could see her chest and the sides of her breasts, the heart beating under her translucent skin, her lungs inflating with each breath. Her skin was glass. No, not glass. Ice. I staggered backwards into the parking lot, tripping over my own 2 feet and landing back hard on my hands and rear end. I could hear the lady laughing, the laughter fading into the night. I got up to my feet and she was gone. I rushed into our motel room and flicked on the lights. That's where I found Shane, lying naked on the bed, eyes closed and face all contorted. He wasn't moving a muscle. His back was arched and rigid, while his neck was extended as far back as it could stretch, with the crown of his head touching the mattress. His heels were planted firmly at the other end, with toes curled. "Shane, buddy, you okay?" I asked and instantly felt stupid. Of course, there was no response. He didn't move to my touch and felt stiff, like rigor mortis had set in. But I wasn't an expert in such things, and it didn't seem to explain the fact that his body felt ice cold. I also couldn't ignore the fact that his back wasn't the only thing rigid. It almost looked like he had died mid-thrust, frozen in place. His now permanent facial expression could have been one of pleasure or pain. The tips of various extremities looked black. Frostbite. I tossed a sheet over his lower half and went to the motel office to call the authorities. There was no definitive cause of death, no mention of hypothermia. I wonder if he thawed or something like that by the time they got there. They wondered if a black widow spider had bitten him. It could cause muscle spasms like that, they said. I told them I had seen a woman leave the room. There had been no signs of foul play. Maybe he had been poisoned. I didn't tell them that this was all because he had paid the price for not following a rule we had heard about on a mysterious broadcast. I didn't tell them that the woman's skin was ice, and you could see her heart in her chest, pumping the blue blood through her veins. I've lived with this all these years. My life has been no different. The world keeps spinning and largely seems to play by the natural rules I've known all my life. The only thing that's changed is the simple inconvenience whenever I travel. Your grandma used to make fun of me about the ice machine habit, and I told her a version of this story with the crazier stuff taken out. I told her I do it as an homage to my old buddy Shane, gone too soon from this world, taken in a manner too strange to grieve. You're the only one I've told the entire story to, and here's why. I've had the feeling over the past few months that things haven't been right. I have a cough that's more than a smoker's cough, a cough I can't quite shake, a heaviness in my chest. Last week, the doctor took an X-ray and confirmed it, a mass in my lungs. He said it looked inoperable and offered chemo. I know where I stand on that. I'm going to go out on my own terms. Not gonna wait until the cancer spreads everywhere, getting a little worse each day. I'm also not gonna poison myself with no chemo. I'm sitting in a little motel called the Relax Inn out by the interstate. You know the one. It's right across the parking lot from the Blue Ribbon Diner we used to always go to. After I finish this letter, I'm gonna sit back and watch a little TV, smoke my first cigarette in 5 years, and go to sleep. What I won't do is fill the ice bucket. I'll ignore the rule, and I'll wait for her to come to me in the dark. It seems like a good way to go out. As good as any. One final kick of pleasure before I kick the bucket. A motel bed sure beats a hospital bed. I hope you understand. Love, Grandpa Doug Pease. I hate to put you out like this or worry you, but it's better this way. You're welcome to contact the authorities for a wellness check. I'd hate for you to find my body in the gruesome and bizarre state it will be in. I'm in room 127. It took me about 2 hours to arrive at the Relax Inn. I mulled the story over and over in my head, the whole way over, finding it harder and harder to believe. Still, there were other ways he could kill himself. I'd seen the bottles of morphine tablets they'd prescribed him, the ones his stoic seldom took. Grandpa's burgundy Mercury Sable was parked outside room 127, faded Navy veteran bumper sticker in the corner of the rear window. Dread coated my stomach, and the Old Spice I'd put on earlier that day was no match for the anxiety-soured sweat now coating my armpits. I contemplated picking up my phone and calling the authorities, but there was a decision I had made on my way over here. I was going to enter the room. I had to see for myself. I had to see him one last time. Fearing the door would be locked and that I'd have to regroup, I approached the door with trepidation. He had left the key in the door. I reached to turn the key, paused. Was I really going to do this? To see my grandpa dead like this, body rigid and frostbitten, his elderly icicle erection tenting the bedsheet. Did I even believe his story? It was impossible. Mr. Freeze was from the comic books. People didn't just freeze solid in motel beds. I took a deep breath and went inside. A Western played on the muted TV. A bucket sat on the middle of the dresser, and my grandpa Doug lay in the middle of the bed, curled on his side. The water in the ice bucket was still cold, and his body was still warm. But there was no heartbeat, no breaths. His half-lidded eyes stared into nothingness, and his pupils didn't respond to my phone's flashlight. On the nightstand sat an empty prescription bottle and a note. This is what it said. Of course, I couldn't go through with it. I'm writing this postscript hours before I tune out. Even now, I still think about it, how it would be a great way to go out. Yet maybe I'm scared. Scared of the lady with the frigid lips and the icy skin, how it would feel to die that way. But I don't think that's it. I think it's because of your grandma. After she died, I never had another woman. How could I see her in heaven with that as my final act? Even though I got ripped off and have missed her every day, she was enough for a lifetime. I can wait just a little while longer. So, we end up back where we started, me at a cemetery with Grandpa. Except this time, he's underground, and it's his headstone I'm thinking of rubbing, the one he shares with my grandmother. I don't go through with it, though. The act seems better suited to the older graves of faceless ancestors, and he was anything but. He was my grandfather, a man I loved and knew. I'll carry him around in different ways. The quiet demeanor that I exhibit, the way I furrow my brow when lost in thought, the penchant for a good Western, and the bucket of ice I will fill at every overnight motel I find myself in. Story 2. If you see these symptoms from your friends while camping, do not approach or attempt to help. Run and call 911. It wasn't my dog, but that's what the police are saying. That my precious bazooka killed those people, that she just snapped, that she's a bully breed and broke into the cabin and mauled them. I'm facing charges for the deaths of the family who are staying there. What happened was a tragedy, but whatever killed them wasn't my dog. It's still out there, up in northern Minnesota, on that small picturesque lake where we rented the cabin. I hope this warning reaches people. To those who believe I'm responsible, Bazooka would never have done such a thing. She was a good dog. I know she has an aggressive name, but that's because it's the name she came with when I adopted her from the rescue group. She was an untrained pit lab mix, black with a white muzzle and paws, and she was like a wrecking ball on four legs with the propulsion of a rocket. I couldn't change her name because after a month of me trying to call her Beverly, she still only answered to Bazooka, but what she lacked in intellect, she made up for in affection. Every night, she crawled onto my bed, all 70 pounds of her, and then after me pushing her off a few times eventually, I'd give up and let her stay. And any time I opened my eyes, I'd find her muzzle almost in my face, her dark eyes gazing into mine, like she was memorizing every feature. Bazooka was everything to me, and I just... Sorry for going on. I miss her. Anyway. So about the cabins. We had a rental for the weekend. See, my friend Jake and I both like board games, and sometimes we got together with this couple, Ray and Rashida, who are also board game geeks. Jake was always talking about how it would be fun to have a weekend board game getaway at a cabin. Ray and Rashida were into the idea, and I agreed as long as I could bring my dog. So we rented this lakeshore cabin that shares the beach with a neighboring cabin and a couple houses across the water. Like a postcard. Kayaks and canoes docked for our use. A grill, fire pit, wood pile. Spacious too, with a balcony, deck, and bedrooms upstairs as well as in the basement. Perfect for a gaming getaway. That first afternoon, we cooked hot dogs and veggie burgers out on the grill and played board games on the balcony table. The only downside was when I went out to take my dog for a walk and noticed two boys down by the water, one of them peeing off the dock into the lake, the other ripping up a pool noodle and throwing pieces at ducks and laughing when they tried to eat it. On my way back from walking in the woods, the same two kids, now dressed, had guns slung over their shoulders as they headed out into the trees. Who lets children run around the woods with guns? They couldn't have been more than 12 years old. I mean, I guess people out in rural Minnesota do that kind of thing. For me, coming from the city, it was pretty alarming. I decided from then on, I'd keep my dog on a leash. I just didn't want to risk her being near those boys whose behavior was so disrespectful to nature and animals. But I didn't let them sour my evening. After our next round of board games, we started up a fire and sat around it roasting marshmallows and drinking. We sat like that under the stars, just talking, and it was the closest I'd felt to anyone in a long time. The next morning, I woke up at the butt crack of dawn because Bazooka was whining to go out, and I dragged myself up and stumbled out in a robe, opening the door for her and forgetting for a moment that I'd resolved to keep her leashed. As the morning air hit me, I woke up enough to go out after her and found her sniffing around the docks. I frowned because that's when I noticed the kayaks out on the water, but nobody in them. Presumably the kids again, causing mischief. But at least it was quiet for now in the neighboring cabin. I took Bazooka back in after she finished her business. Once everyone was up, we went out on the lake for a canoe trip with Bazooka leaping out into the water and paddling around, and then nearly capsizing us when she tried to climb back in. After a lunch of homemade pizza, we spent the afternoon back at our board games until the sun lowered in the sky. Ray and Rashida wanted s'mores, but since we didn't have marshmallows and chocolate, they decided to drive into town. That left Jake and me at the bonfire sipping beers and watching the stars come out in the deepening twilight. We were so busy marveling at all the stars you could see out here that we didn't hear or notice anything until Bazooka's deep, throaty growl alerted us. All the hairs on my neck stood on end. I looked out blearily across the fire. By now, I'd had enough beer to be buzzed, and beyond the flames stood one of the kids. The younger one, 11-ish. He was dripping wet, as if he'd come out of the water, all but naked in swim trunks that had come untied and were loosely slipping down his hips to the point of immodesty. Jesus fuck. Jake gasped, his big hand going to his chest. He sputtered on his beer. Almost gave me a heart attack, kid. Bazooka stood a few feet from the kid, head down, hackles raised, that low growl still deep in her throat. Bazooka, I called, and she glanced at me but kept growling until I snapped her name louder, and she reluctantly came to my side, but still that rumble sounded from her chest. Kid, everything okay? Jake was asking. He heaved himself up and went over and snapped his fingers in front of the boy's face. Kid, kid. The boy's head slowly turned, glazed eyes lifting to look at Jake. A line of drool dribbled from the boy's lower lip, silvery in the firelight. Is he all right? I said. I'd better get him to his parents. Maybe he's having some kind of episode. Jake clapped a hand on the boy's shoulder and steered him along the grass onto the dirt pathway leading over to the other cabin. I was glad Jake took him. I didn't want to admit it, but I was fully creeped out by the kid's 1,000-yard stare, as well as by Bazooka's behavior. She'd never been a bright dog. Sliding glass doors were impossible for her. She always rammed right into them. And she was equally mystified by doggy doors. Her playmate Rocky had a doggy door at his house, and every time he went through the flap, she stared afterwards like it was magic. But she had good instincts, and she sensed something definitely wrong with that boy. So did I, if only I'd listened to the feeling in my gut. The night was nearly pitch black by the time tires crunched in the gravel. Ray and Rashida were back. I heaved a sigh of relief, because Jake still wasn't back from the other cabin, and I was getting concerned. Music played from their car, and as they stepped out with bags of groceries, I called to them and explained that Jake had brought the boy to the neighboring cabin and hadn't come back. Ray and Rashida peppered me with questions. Was he sick? Did you call an ambulance? What kind of symptoms did he seem to have? After a brief discussion, I locked up Bazooka and the three of us made our way over to the neighboring cabin. Moonlight shone down on us, casting the world in a silvery light as our footsteps crunched in the gravel. It was eerie quiet, the only sound Bazooka's barking, more and more distant. I heard her pawing against the glass door. Good thing she didn't know how to use the doggy door, or she'd have come charging after us. Though honestly, I kinda wished I'd brought her. Even with three of us, I was anxious, a pit of dread in my gut. An instinctive dread that I wish now I'd listened to. When we knocked on the door, it swung in slightly. The cabin was pitch dark inside. "Hello," called Ray. "Hello," silence. We shined our flashlights around. The cabin was nearly identical to ours, but the floor had a scattering of clothes and a towel. Seems the boys just threw their stuff down wherever they went. Ray fumbled along and found a lamp, switched it on. Her shriek made me jump. For an instant, I swear my soul left my body. Then I saw what had startled her. There, standing in the center of the cabin's rustic living room, was Jake. He was swaying, his lips slack and eyes sort of wobbling to and fro. And then he collapsed. He was a mountain of a man, and the impact shook the floor with a resounding thud. Somewhere below, I thought I heard an echo or another thud, like someone else moving. Jake, Ray was next to him in an instant, checking his pupils, his breathing. He was breathing slowly but regularly. His eyes still open, though he did nothing except look slowly at whoever was talking, Ray mostly, though his eyes moved to me when I said, "I'm calling 911. I'm going to look around and see if I can find anyone," said Rashida. I don't remember the next moments very well. Just that I was on the phone with the dispatcher, trying to explain the strange sequence of events and the symptoms of the boy and now Jake, while Ray was speaking at the same time, trying to talk him through whatever he was experiencing, trying to ascertain what was wrong with him. And then, just as the dispatcher was telling me how soon help could get here, a scream rang from above. Then rapid footsteps. Rashida rushed down, shrieking. A woman. There's a woman up there, with her face ripped open and blood everywhere, even as she rushed down from upstairs. I saw the figure coming up from the opposite direction, ascending the stairs from the basement, and lurking behind her. The boy, still clad only in his swim trunks, had dripping hands and red smeared across his face. I raised my arm to point, gasping, and Rashida saw my expression and turned and screamed as the boy lunged at her. Ray saw him in that moment too, and shrieked. The boy knocked Rashida to the floor, shockingly strong and fast. He bared his bloody teeth. I think he'd have tried to eat her face the same as his mother, but at that moment, a black blur shot out of nowhere. 70 lbs of ferocious pit bull slammed into the boy's scrawny body, knocking him off her. Apparently in this moment of crisis, Bazooka had figured out the flap door. "Run!" I shouted. "Run!" I yanked Rashida toward the front door. Ray hesitated, still kneeling over Jake, but there was no way she could lift him. Even with three of us, we'd have needed time to move him, and we didn't have that. She rushed after us. The three of us burst out into the night. "Bazooka, come." Come. I shouted, but the snarling sounds from the boy and dog continued inside. Ray and Rashida dashed into their car. Come on, come on. Ray called to me. I'll be right behind you. I can't leave Jake and my dog. Go. Get help. I shouted. The tires squealed over the gravel as they took off, leaving me alone in the gravel road under the moonlight. No company, but the 911 dispatcher's tinny voice still on the phone. As soon as they were gone, it struck me how foolish I was, how exposed and helpless, and most of all how loud the dispatcher's voice was, shooting questions at me. I hung up the phone and rushed into our cabin and shut the door. Hurried to find my keys. My keys? Where were my fucking keys? I finally found them on the coffee table by the fireplace and turned to rush to the door and froze. There, just outside on the deck, standing in plain view through the glass sliding doors, was Jake. Just standing there, staring in, his eyes sweeping to and fro, like he was looking for someone. I ducked down behind the sofa and crawled toward the door. Froze at the sound of the deck door sliding open. He'd entered the cabin. Was he feeling better? The urge to call out nearly brought words to my lips, but this time my instincts overrode the impulse. I stayed quiet. Jake's heavy footsteps took him across the room. He wandered upstairs. Should I call to him? And then I had an idea. A way to be sure. My iPad was downstairs in the basement. I tugged out my phone, shifting it to silent mode, and I called my iPad. Heard the jingle from my phone calling it, and then heavy thuds. Jake came barreling down the stairs, charging at top speed, knocking over a potted plant at the bottom of the stairs and heedlessly crashing down toward the basement. Not a normal reaction. Not at all. Panic sent sirens through my brain. I couldn't open the front door without him hearing the latch. The sliding door to the deck was still open. As silently as possible, I slipped out and rushed along the moonlit dark out to the gravel. My car was parked a ways up the hill, close to the stacks of firewood. Each step away from the cabin, I breathed a little easier, until I heard a soft crunch on the gravel ahead of me. I shined my phone's light. There, standing in front of my car, was Bazooka. Her head hung low, droopy. She listed to one side. Her mouth hung open, and her eyes stared at my flashlight. No, 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 not you too. A wave of terror and exhaustion hit me. I was so sure I was doomed. She's so fast, there was no outrunning her. But even more than feeling afraid, I was upset. I took a step toward her and only stopped myself at the last second. Bazooka, I whispered. Her snout lifted, and then to my shock, her tail moved. A slow wag side to side. Bazooka, are you still in there? I drew a shaky breath as I waited for her to attack me, and when she didn't, I mustered myself and said in my sternest voice, "Sit." For a long moment, she stared. Then her haunches wavered. She sat. "Stay," I said. I walked around her and got into my car and looked at her. She was watching me, her jaws still slack in the same way as the others had been, her eyes following me. I could feel myself tearing up as I said, "Good dog," and her tail thumped. And then I drove away. I still don't know what was in those woods. The body of the younger kid in swim trunks had Bazooka's teeth marks from when she defended us, and because of that, they apparently concluded she must have been responsible for mauling the woman upstairs, and a man who must have been the kid's father. The oldest boy's body was not found, and Jake's death was listed as heart attack, and Bazooka is still missing. To be honest, that's been the hardest part. I know I shouldn't say that when human lives were lost, but losing my beloved dog has been worse than the blame, worse than the charges I'm facing now. I wonder if there is some part of her that remembers even now. If she's still in those woods, running wild with her empty eyes, running and listening, waiting to hear her name be called again. Story 3. I'm working at a Christian summer camp. Some weird things are going on. I'm currently spending my summer at an evangelical Christian camp in Northern Ontario. I don't want to give out the name, so let's call it Camp Yaniwana. It's located near Algonquin Park, and the place is really remote. There's not even cell reception. I've typed this out on my phone during the week, and am sending it now that I'm in town for our day off. I'm working here because, frankly, I didn't have anything better to do. I didn't want to spend another summer in the hot, sticky city, living at home and being bored out of my mind at some minimum wage retail job. And I didn't really need the money either. I have a bit of a side gig at school that pays the bills without too much work. It's not exactly legal, but the police have never batted an eye, and Waterloo has quite the student customer base. So when one of my friends suggested volunteering along with him at Yaniwana, I jumped at the opportunity. I'm great with kids, and being up in the middle of the woods for 2 months sounded like a great time. Plus, there had to be more than a few girls for me to get to know, out in the middle of nowhere with very little competition. I applied, had a brief phone interview, was hired, and a week ago I drove up with my friend, Jonathan, to start a week of staff training. I really wasn't sure what to anticipate before I got here, but so far, this place has not been what I expected. It's secluded and rustic, that's for sure. The cabins have flaps for doors and windows, tabins, as they call them. For tent-plus cabin, the washrooms are, well, very close to nature, and my God, this place gets dark at night. But that's not too bad. The air is so damn fresh, and the lake the camp sits on is freezing cold, but it feels kinda amazing when you jump in. And the bugs haven't been too aggressive yet. Might be the fact that the sun is hard during the day, but the temperature plummets at night. No, it's the people, more than anything, who've really surprised me. For one thing, they are super religious. I mean, I go to church occasionally, and I guess I believe in God, but everyone here seems to be gunning to be the next pope, except they say they don't follow the pope. I think I understand that. They pray before each meal, have a church service every day, and during one of our staff training sessions, we were told about how important it was that every kid who comes here gets to know Jesus, and with that religiosity comes some really, really strict rules. Guys and girls tabins are on opposite ends of the camp. Absolutely no physical intimacy is allowed between members of the opposite gender, though. When you think about it, that leaves a hell of a loophole. In fact, a guy and a girl can't even be in a cabin alone together. Hearing that definitely put a damper on one of my goals for the summer. Also, some of the people here are pretty strange. One girl has claimed that she literally hears God's voice when she prays. Another says that she once healed a friend with a broken ankle by putting her hands on it. And then there's Jordan, who's been going to Yaniwana since he was like 4. When I met him, he looked me up and down, and then stared at the middle of my forehead. When I asked him if everything was okay, he smirked and said, "I guess you'll find out soon." Then, the second night, he announced during prayer time that he could sense dark, evil forces attacking the camp, and that we have to be strong, because Satan has us in his sight. So, yeah, it's a Christian camp all right. But I've been making do as best as I can. I signed up to instruct the camp's rock climbing and high ropes course, and I'm glad I did. They have a 50-foot rock wall that is a serious challenge to climb. And walking on a tightrope 30 feet above the ground with only a flimsy rope to support me is pretty fun. I also made friends with the less fundamentalist counselors, some of whom will even have the occasional drink, or even a hit of a bong if they're feeling really adventurous. Safe to say my side hustle wouldn't do so well in these parts. Among the friends I made was Kate. She was in my rocks or ropes group, though I can't say I paid her much attention for the first few days. On Tuesday, though, she sat next to me at the evening church service, and as Smokey, the camp's director, was 30 minutes into his rant on the evils of homosexuality, she leaned over and whispered, "Seems a bit hypocritical." Given the massive stick he has up his ass, it took all my might to not break into hysterics. The next day, we were inseparable. We made jokes while climbing. We kept rolling our eyes at each other whenever Smokey went off on a rant on the state of our culture, and we sat nice and close during meals and the nightly campfire. I have no idea why she didn't catch my eye earlier. She had cute little face, wavy brown hair that looks perfect even in the middle of the woods, and a body that's fine even in the mandatory one-piece swimsuits all the girls have to wear. Wednesday evening, after we parted ways following the church service, I went back to my cabin with a new spring in my step. Maybe I could actually make a move on Kate. She seemed cool enough to flaunt the rules. And even if she wasn't, at least I had someone fun to hang out with for the rest of the summer. As I fell asleep, I remember thinking that this summer might actually be pretty good for me. And that's when things started to get weird. I sometimes suffer from what I can only describe as waking nightmares. There's a specific medical term for it, but I'm in the middle of nowhere with no internet access, so whatever. I'll wake up and see and hear things that aren't there often. It will be someone in bed next to me, or spiders all over the walls, or ghosts flying through my room. It's really freaky, and it's caused more than a few issues with my roommates back at school, but I've learned to live with it. Wednesday night, I woke up at like 3 a.m. and saw this huge, towering black figure at the front of my cabin, just inside the doorway. It was easily 10 feet tall, and in the faint light from outside, it seemed to be wearing dark robes that went all the way down to the floor. I couldn't see any face or any body parts at all, but there was a malevolence, an evil, radiating from this thing. I pulled my blanket tight against myself in sheer terror and let out a small gasp. The figure's hooded head suddenly turned to me and seemed to look right at me. I tried to say something, or even to move, but I was frozen in fear. The thing faced me for another few seconds before backing out of the cabin. I swear, I heard the flaps move as it did. My paralysis finally broke, and I jumped out of bed and ran outside, looking for the intruder. There was nothing, just a circle of cabins in the cold, dark night. After a few deep breaths, the cool air woke me up a bit, and I convinced myself that I was just having another waking nightmare. I went back into the cabin and lay back down, though it took me a while to fall asleep. The next day, Kate and I spent all the time we could together, to the point where it felt like we were already dating. We just needed to make it official. I saw the opportunity Thursday night, after a 2-hour evening church service. Kate asked me if she could talk to me about something, so we headed down one of the paths leading away from the Great Lodge. She seemed nervous, so I thought I'd break the ice by telling her about my hallucination the night before. As I described it, she slowed her walk down until she came to a complete stop. She looked right at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Do you think it was a demon?" she asked. Her voice was almost shaking. I laughed a bit and said, "No, I think it was just a dream." She grabbed my hands tightly. "You need to be more careful. This place is a battleground for spiritual forces." Then she let go and turned down the path leading to the girls' cabins, leaving me stunned. I would have chased after her, but that would have broken the camp's cardinal rule. The next day, Kate was almost a totally different person. During our final day of rocks or ropes training, she sat as far away from me as possible and only gave quick, curt responses to my questions. At the end of the day, as we had our graduation ceremony and received personalized carabiners, she gave all the others a tight hug but me just a quick pat on the shoulder. And she kept herself surrounded by other counselors, so I couldn't ask her why she was being so distant. I didn't have any chance to talk to her one-on-one, like we'd done a dozen times earlier in the week, and by the time the day ended, it was driving me mad. I could feel her soft hands grabbing mine, though I guess I thought the first time we held hands would be more romantic and not born out of fear, and her worries about demons and spiritual battles seemed so out of character for her. One of the things I liked about her was that she didn't seem to subscribe to all the crazier aspects of the camp's religious beliefs. Her reaction to my dream said otherwise. It was close to midnight, and I was wide awake. I knew I had to talk to her. I quietly climbed out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and put on my darkest clothes. Then I headed out towards her cabin, moving through the black forest path as deftly as I could and listening for any sounds of other people. I knew I'd be in a lot of trouble if I was caught out here. The path led out of the forest and then slopped down to the girls' cabins below. I stopped at the top of the hill and looked at them, focusing on hers. It occurred to me that I didn't actually have a plan from here. Kate shared her cabin with a few other counselors, just like I did, and I didn't know which bunk was hers. What was I expecting to do? Wake her up and ask her to talk to me? There was a 99% chance that would end with shouting, a few punches, and me being sent home. As I stared at Kate's cabin from the hill, movement beyond it caught my eye. Someone was running through the soccer fields to the north, heading towards the cabins. I could barely make out the person, but I could see their flashlights swinging in their arms as they ran. They were moving at breakneck speed. Maybe someone realizing they'd gone way past curfew. The person got closer, and in the faint moonlight, I could make out their hot pink t-shirt and the long hair flowing behind them. Oh God. Kate. What was she doing? Kate reached the circle of cabins, but instead of going in, she cut around them and then started running away towards another section of the forest to the west. I wanted to call after her, but I knew it would wake up at least a few people. I wanted to chase after her, though I already knew I wouldn't be able to catch her. She was a veteran of this place, and I could barely navigate the forest in broad daylight. Still, I had to try. I took a step and was about to break off into a sprint when I saw it. Or I think I saw it. It was another figure, moving through the soccer fields towards the cabins. This one was all black, and I had to squint, because I honestly don't know if I was truly seeing it, or if my mind and eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure, as I saw it, followed Kate's path around the cabins and into the trees to the west, where it promptly disappeared from sight. What on earth? I found myself falling down onto the cool grass, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. For a minute, I wondered if I was currently dreaming up this surreal scene. Why was Kate running? Where was she going? And did I see something chase her? An ear-piercing scream from the woods broke me out of my daze. I jumped up and was once again about to start running for the forest when several lights in the cabins came on. Shit. They couldn't see me. I spun around and ran back through the woods and into my cabin. I got back in my sleeping bag and eventually fell asleep. That was last night. This morning, Kate wasn't at breakfast, and when I asked the head staff where she was, I was told that she wasn't well and had gone home. Her bunkmates and our fellow rocks or ropes instructors didn't have anything to add beyond that it seems like everyone I've spoken to has repeated the line of Kate being not well, and then telling me not to worry about it when I pressed on what was wrong. So that's where things are now. The campers arrive tomorrow for the first weekly session of the summer. I'm excited to meet the boys in my cabin, and when I get the chance, I'm going to explore the forest to the west of the girls' cabins and see if I can find anything about Kate's disappearance. I'll update you again next week when I'm back in town and have cell reception. I'll say this, though. I'm unsure about God And I don't really believe in demons. But like I said, there's something weird going on here at Camp Yaniwana. Let me start with the good news. My campers this week were awesome. I had a cabin of 6 12-year-old boys, and though I was initially nervous about it, this being my first time as a counselor ever, it turns out kids these days are actually really freaking cool. Yes, they talked about video games all the time, and I don't think more than 30 minutes ever went by without someone flossing or dabbing. I really thought both of those things were over. But beyond that, I was amazed at how insightful my campers were. Every night, I was supposed to do a Bible study with them, where we'd read from the good book and discuss how it pertained to our lives. But since my knowledge of the Bible is a bit rusty, for example, I didn't know it was broken down beyond Old and New Testament. I just opened up the floor to discuss what mattered to them in their lives. And their responses blew my mind. All of them were super concerned about the planet and what they could do to save it. One kid knew the price of Telsa's stock. WF. A few of them said they were glad to be away from their phones for a week because of how often they felt they had to check them. And when I asked what their biggest fears were, I received a few standard answers: heights, spiders, until one boy said, having a video of me doing something embarrassing go viral, and they all agreed with that. Just wow. Rock climbing instruction went great too. All I had to do was get kids in a harness, belay them as they climbed, cheer them on if they got stuck, and lower them down when they reached the top or were too scared to go higher. So yeah, on the counselor side of things, I crushed it this week. If Yaniwana paid its staff anything, I'd totally be in line for a bonus. On the non-counselor side of things, it's been a different story. On a Sunday, the day the campers arrived, I was still reeling from what I thought I saw with Kate, and despite the flat answers I'd been getting from the other staff, I was still asking as many people as I could what had happened to her. More than a few of them had barely any idea who I was referring to in the first place, but those who did kept repeating the line about her being not well when I asked what on earth that even meant. I was stonewalled. Sunday night, as the worship band, a 5-piece rock band that plays Christian music, simultaneously awesome and lame, was singing about Romans 16-something, Jonathan pulled me aside. "You need to stop asking questions about Kate," he said. His tone was low and harsh, threatening, almost. I was shocked. I'd known this guy for several years and had come up to camp at his invitation, and now he was telling me to stop looking into this hella mysterious disappearance. I started to object, but he cut me off. "I'm serious. Don't look into this any further." His eyebrows went way up, and he gave me a look, the kind you give when you're trying to tell someone to read between the lines. "Just drop it." Then he smiled a tiny bit and went back into the lodge, where he joined in with his campers, jumping up and down to the music. I stayed outside for another few minutes, trying to figure out what had just happened. I hadn't even asked Jonathan about Kate, and yet he had known clearly. Word was getting around. The last thing I wanted was to be making waves just a week into this 8-week stay. So I did as my friend asked and stopped directly asking questions. There were other ways I needed to investigate Kate's disappearance anyway, ways that, hopefully, would not be as frustrating as asking questions of the tightest-lipped teenagers in the province. Tuesday morning, as all the cabins lined up for breakfast, I noticed a few groups of girls openly crying. Their counselors tried to calm them down, but they seemed just as distraught, with pale faces and wide, fearful eyes. I didn't think too much of it. Maybe someone had been hurt and had to go home, or a bad bout of homesickness had made its way into the cabins. That evening, after a lengthy campfire filled with admittedly hilarious skits and way too much singing, all the male staff were asked to stay behind as the campers went back to their cabins. Once we were alone, Donald, the male staff leader, stood up and asked us to gather in closely. In the fire's dying light, I could see the anger in his face. I know I have said this before, but it obviously needs repeating. You're not, absolutely not, allowed to pull pranks on the girls. That means the campers, the staff, and any of their property. I glanced around at the other counselors. If they were as confused as I was, they didn't show it. Donald continued, "Whoever vandalized the girls' cabins last night, I hope you know it wasn't funny at all. It terrified a whole bunch of campers, and now Smokey and Beth, the female staff leader, are going to have to explain it to their parents at the end of the week. I shouldn't even have to tell you the consequences for doing this. I expect better from all of you." He dismissed us. As we headed back to our cabins, I sidled up next to a group walking together and asked them if they knew what Donald had been talking about. Yeah, apparently in the middle of the night last night, there were some weird screeching sounds around the girls' cabins, one of them said. And then this morning, there were weird claw marks burnt into the wood. Shoot, I said. And Donald thinks one of us did it. He's wrong too, it was Jordan. Loud screeches and burnt claw marks in the middle of the night aren't a prank. It's signs that this spiritual warfare is entering our physical world. There was a mixed reaction from the other boys. We all need to go back to our cabins and pray for this camp and these campers. The enemy wants us to be scared so that these kids won't hear about Jesus' love for them. I wanted to suggest that maybe mentioning Satan and spiritual warfare was causing this fear, but I bit my tongue. I went back to my cabin, got my campers into bed, and then started a conversation about family that eventually devolved into a discussion of their favorite TikTok videos. So it goes. The next day, after a morning of unsuccessfully trying to get just one camper to climb an overhang, I found myself with a few hours off, as the rest of camp had a massive game of capture the flag, real-life Overwatch, as one genius counselor called it. After resting in my bunk for half an hour, eating a few Mars bars from the tuck shop, and writing the 1,200 words you've read so far, I decided it was time to further my investigation. I headed to the girls' cabins, following the same path I had on Friday night, when I'd gone to talk to Kate. It was much easier to navigate the forest in the daylight, and when I wasn't worried about being seen. But when I left the tree cover and saw the cabins from the top of the hill, I froze up. I'd been in that very spot when I'd seen Kate running from. Something, I think. I sighed. I should have chased after her, or at the very least, called after her. I'd been a coward and allowed my fear of being caught breaking these stupid religious rules to make my decision. Damn it. No, there was no time for regrets. I shook the memories away and walked down the path and into the center of the dozen or so cabins. It didn't take much time to find the claw marks the guy had mentioned, though to call them claws was a bit of an understatement. These were like a bird's talons, but much bigger. Each of the 4 appendages burned into the wood was a good 6 inches long. I rubbed my thumbnail along the mark, but nothing came off. This wasn't some impressive paint job. These things were burnt on. A quick search showed that 3 of the cabins had been hit with this mark, all of them to the right of the doorframe. One of the cabins had been the one Kate stayed in. Was that a coincidence? It had to be. I mean, this had to just be a sick prank. Right? As I stared at the charred symbol, one of the cabin's front flaps opened, and a sleepy-looking girl stared out at me. "What are you doing here?" she asked in a hoarse voice. Sorry," I said. I had to drop off a rock climbing harness. Not a bad lie. She gave me a look and then went back into her cabin. I took that as a sign to get out, but I still had more investigating to do. I left the girls' cabins and headed west into the forest, following the same route I'd seen Kate take on the Friday night. There was only one path through the trees, and a narrow and overgrown one at that. I quickly found myself surrounded by green, leafy brush, unable to see more than 5 feet in front of me. I tried to do the math in my head. I'd seen Kate go into the forest, and then heard her scream, what, 30 seconds later? And in the darkness of the night, with just a flashlight to guide her, she could probably take 2 steps a second, even if she were moving as fast as she could, if she had in fact been running from something I think I saw. I counted out 60 steps and stopped. My view hadn't changed, just branches and leaves. I crouched down and looked for footprints, though the ground was dry and hard and didn't show me anything. I raised my own foot and stomped it down to see if it would make an indent. Nothing. I would not be a very good man tracker. I was about to stand back up when I spotted a blotch of red on a rock in front of me. It didn't take me long to realize what it was. I grabbed a twig and rubbed it. It scraped off easily. This blood was fresh. My heart simultaneously leapt and deflated. I finally had a clue, but the worst kind. I stood back up and looked around for more. It wasn't hard to find there were little specks and splotches on the ground and streaked along some larger leaves. I followed it further down the path, where the blood marks became larger and more noticeable. I'm normally not able to handle the sight of blood in the best of circumstances here. My stomach felt like it could explode at any second. I was so preoccupied with finding the blood that I didn't notice the path's ending until I was suddenly out of the surrounding trees and in a small clearing of about half an acre, with what looked like a large junk heap in the center. The sunlight once again hit my face, and I took a second to calm myself and take a few deep breaths. Then I walked up to the thing in the middle. It wasn't a junk heap, it was the remains of a building that looked like it had burned down long ago. Parts of a metal frame, now charred and bent in all sorts of directions, stood in the ground, with chunks of wood and stone still clinging to a few pieces. I slowly walked around it, looking for any further sights of blood. There was nothing among the ash and soot that lay heavily on the ground, nor the pieces of rubble scattered through the wreckage. There was, however, a smell that I recognized, but couldn't place. It seemed to permeate all through the clearing, and it got stronger as I approached the building's remains. I couldn't actually step into the rubble, the collapsed wood. Stone and metal would undoubtedly leave me with some nasty cuts along my legs if I tried to. But I looked at it with awe and more than a little fear. What was this place? I'd never heard of it during our training, and none of the counselors or campers had mentioned it. Seemed strange to have the ruins of this structure in the middle of the forest and not tell anyone about it. I spent another 5 minutes looking around, but I couldn't find any more blood, be it in the clearing or on the surrounding trees. There was only one other path I could find, this one just as narrow and branch-ridden as the one I'd came in on. I followed it. It ended close to the camp's lodge, though as I stepped out and looked back, it was almost impossible to see it again. That night, over dinner of chicken and bacon wraps, have I mentioned that the food at Yaniwana is amazing. I told my campers about my discovery earlier that day. They were quick to fill me in on it. It's the burnt place, one of them said. It used to be used for teaching about nature and survival and things, but it burned down like 5 years ago. 2 years ago, another one corrected. I remember because I was at camp when it happened. No, you weren't, said a third boy. It burned down in the spring when it was hit by lightning. I held up my hands to keep an argument from breaking out. So you all know of it? A bunch of head nods. But we're not allowed to go near it. They used to make such a big deal of staying away. Apparently, some kid went to it and got trapped, and they had to cut his leg off. Oh, come on, that never happened. More arguing. I went back to my rap. This place had a name and a lore as well. The rest of my week was uneventful, though I have to admit it was hard to say goodbye to my campers this morning. They all gave me such big hugs before they went home. And now I have to get ready for a whole new batch tomorrow. I also need to figure out my next step for Kate. The fact that her blood led me to the burnt place has to mean something, right? Wish me luck. I'll write again next week. Oh, and one more thing. As I was walking through town, trying to find a decent data connection, I saw a landscaping company lugging around big bags of fertilizer on a lawn, and I finally recognized the scent that had been at the burnt place. How could I not? It had been burned into my nostrils in grade 11 chemistry. Sunday night, after the campers had arrived and done their swim tests in the still freezing cold lake, and after we'd finished dinner and sung a few songs, Donald and Beth stood up in front of everyone to welcome them to week 2 of Yaniwana's 2019 summer. It was similar to the speech they'd given the week before, basic explanation of the camp's facilities, how to sign up for the different instructions, and rules for staying safe throughout the week. At the end, Donald added one more thing that he hadn't mentioned the previous week. There are a lot of fun things to do up here, he said. But there are also areas that aren't safe. That includes the woods. You're allowed to go, though, the forest path leading to the girls' cabins if you're a girl, of course, that produced a few laughs. But all other parts of the forest are, shall we say, forbidden. His voice went comically high. More laughs. I felt a shiver go down my spine. That night, as I got to know the new group of boys in my cabin, my questions about their families and what they like to do for fun gradually shifted into talking about Yaniwana itself. All but one of them had been going to this camp for years, and the one who was new was asking all kinds of questions, ones that I really should have asked, to be honest. Best places to watch the sunset, best time to take a shower without waiting for a lineup, what to talk about when around girls, etc. Then he asked about the forest and why it was off limits. Oh, that's because of the burnt place, one of the other campers said. The camp legally can't allow anyone to go near it. Yeah, said another. I heard that the reason it burned down was because people were doing a satanic ritual, and now it's a portal to hell. This elicited a chorus of gasps. A third added, I heard that a few years ago, a camper went there late at night, and he just disappeared. No, that didn't happen. I was surprised by the loudness of my voice. They all looked at me. I smiled. I mean, guys, come on. This camp is totally safe, and the burnt place happened by accident. Now, why don't we, pray, and then we can go to bed. I prayed, asking for a great week, and that God or whoever was listening would keep us all safe, and then shut off the lights. Sleep didn't come for a while. I kept thinking about the burnt place and the rumors surrounding it. Had a camper actually disappeared at it? No, of course not. It wasn't possible. Yaniwana would have been shut down. It would have been all over the news. But what about Kate? Why had her last known place to me been the burnt place? What had happened to her? The next 2 days went on fine, teaching rock climbing in the mornings, doing games and activities in the afternoon, and then worship songs and skits in the evening. My campers were well behaved and didn't seem to notice the occasional time I'd zone out, wondering about Kate and the burnt place. One of them claimed to be dating one of the girl campers, so that held their attention for most of the day. Tuesday night, I woke up around 3 a.m. The cloaked figure was back. He again stood at the entrance to the cabin, just feet away from where I was laying. He seemed even taller this time, his robes even longer and darker. His hooded face slowly moved around the room, as though he were looking at each of my campers before it came to me. I stared into the black space in the hood and felt my blood freeze up. The figure slowly rose his left arm towards me. From the ragged sleeve came a claw, with 4 long, pointed talons. And with it came the indistinguishable smell sulfur. I clutched my sleeping bag and tried to shift back to disappear into my flimsy mattress. No, I breathed. Jesus, no, The figure's arm slowly lowered, and its head turned back to the rest of the cabin. Then its step glided, really back and out through the door. I didn't bother to go looking for it this time. I did a quick scan around my cabin to check that all the boys were okay. They were all still asleep, and then I sighed and lay back down. I was out in seconds. The next morning, I was a bit jarred from my hallucination, and I hoped to God it was just that. But as the day went on, I felt better. One of the campers at rock climbing managed to actually climb the overhang, and I was so excited, I nearly let go of his belay rope. Oops. After rock climbing instruction, I stayed behind to help with the weekly inspection of the climbing ropes. As I was finishing up, a counselor came running up to me, looking worried. He asked where his camper Nathan was. I replied that I wasn't sure, and that all the campers had left a good 20 minutes earlier. He grimaced and said that Nathan hadn't been with the other boys when they'd lined up for lunch. He looked like he was on the verge of a panic attack. "Breathe, buddy," I said as gently as I could. I'd seen him around before, but I doubt I'd said more than 5 words to him. He was a tall kid, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", and looked a few years younger than me. "Come on, let's head back. Maybe Nathan made a pit stop somewhere." He nodded, and we started walking to the main camp. Maybe this will be easier if I draw out a map. I've attached it. As we walked, I introduced myself and asked about him. He said his name's Kyle, and he told me this was his 2nd year as a counselor. He had been in the camp's cabin lead in training last summer, and a camper for 2 years before that. This was his first time managing campers by himself, and he was desperate to do a great job. Not that he had to tell me as much the way he was playing fidgeting around and almost jumping along the road. He seemed as stressed as I was in the height of exam season. As we neared the lodge, there was no sign of Nathan. "Is there anywhere else he could have gone?" I asked. "Does he have a sibling or friend he could have met up with?" He shook his head about 7 times. "No, this is his first summer here. He was asking last night about areas that were out of bounds, and I told him about the burnt place. My heart stopped for a good 2 seconds. "You told him about it?" Again, my voice was way too loud. Kyle seemed to shrink a full foot. "Only that he needed to avoid it," he said meekly. "I'm sure that helped," I snipped. The mess hall was feet away from us, but I wasn't going to check. I cut behind the lodge, looking for the entrance to the path. It took me a few seconds, but I was able to find it. I pushed the branches aside and sprinted through it as quickly as I could, dodging roots, rocks, and branches. I could hear Kyle behind me or more. I could hear multiple twigs and limbs breaking behind me. I turned another winding corner, and at the last second saw the small boy sitting on the ground. I jumped up and over him, but my foot caught a root as I landed, and I spilled onto the dirt. I swore twice before remembering who I was next to. Turning myself around and sitting up, I looked at the boy I'd nearly plowed into. He was looking at me with big, watery eyes and tear-strewn cheeks. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, like I was talking to a wounded animal. "Are you okay?" His head shook a tiny bit before bowing back down into his hands. I heard more breaking sticks come from around the bend as Kyle jogged up to us, his blonde hair covered in twigs and buds. He looked relieved as he saw the boy, but it was short-lived. "What happened?" he asked. I shrugged. Kyle crouched down next to the camper. "Hey, Nathan, what are you doing here?" Nathan again said nothing, but I could hear his sobs coming from behind his hands. I stood back up and dusted myself off. As I checked for any scrapes or blood, I caught that familiar scent again, sulfur. I saw Kyle's nostrils flare before he looked up at me, his eyes wide. I motioned my head back to the main camp. We had to get out of here. Kyle reached down to help Nathan up, but the boy pulled away. "Nate, we have to get going," Kyle said, his voice cracking hard. It's lunchtime. We can't be late for that, right?" A twig cracked behind me. We both jumped right up. I looked around but didn't see any movement. The wind? An animal? I really didn't want to find out. "Nathan, we have to go," I said, trying to hide the fear in my own voice. "Everyone is going to wonder where you are." His sobbing just got louder. "Fine then." I reached down, lifted him up, and started carrying him back down the path. He screamed and flailed around, but I was able to hold his feet to keep him from kicking me. Kyle walked ahead of us, pushing away the tree branches as best as he could. The scent of sulfur gradually faded away, and once we emerged from path, all I could smell was the grilled cheese in the mess hall. I put Nathan down. He immediately collapsed back onto the ground, still crying uncontrollably. Kyle again asked him what had happened, but the boy said nothing. Kyle looked back at me, his own eyes now beginning to tear up. Poor guy. This is probably not what he had expected counseling to be like. "Hey," from around the lodge, in a near sprint, came Donald. "Oh, thank God, there you guys are." He stopped and looked down at Nathan, then at us, as if asking for an explanation. I quickly filled him in on where we had found him. I didn't mention the sulfur or why Nathan would have been on the path in the first place. Donald nodded and then crouched down. "Hey, Nate," he said softly. "Could you look up at me for a second?" The boy's head left his hands and raised up towards the male staff leader. As they made contact, he shrunk back, but he didn't hide his face again. "I was wondering if you could help me. I have all these popsicles in my cabin, and I don't have enough room for all of them in my little freezer. Think you could come and have one or two before they melt?" A small smile cracked on the boy's face, and he nodded slightly. "Awesome," Donald said. He offered Nathan his hands and helped the boy up. He turned back to me and Kyle. "You guys go be with your cabins. I'll talk to you later." Still holding Nathan's hand, he walked off towards his cabin. Kyle and I headed to the mess hall, where there was fortunately enough food left to fill me up. My campers asked where I had been, and I just said it had taken me a long time to inspect all the ropes. I didn't see Nathan or Donald during the afternoon, but at dinner, the camper was back at his table with Kyle and Donald was at the staff table. While dishes were being cleaned, I walked over to the leader and asked how Nathan was. "He's fine now," Donald said. Something clearly shook him up, but it's amazing what a bit of sugar can do to cheer up a kid. He cocked his head to the side, as if to check that no one was listening in, and then said, "So you just found him on that path?" I nodded. His eyes narrowed slightly. "And how did you know to look there?" "Kyle said he'd been asking about the burnt place," I said. "I thought it would be a good place to look," Donald sighed. "I thought I was clear about that place being off limits. He could have been hurt." He pointed a finger at me. "And off limits applies to staff too. Got it?" The finger lowered. "No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be getting angry at you. Thank you for finding him. There's just always been these rumors and stories about it, and it leads kids to try to check it out, and then their imaginations get the best of them. I'm just glad he went during the day." He gave me a pat on the back. "Anyway, thanks again." "For sure." I walked back to my table, passing Kyle and Nathan along the way. They were both laughing along with the rest of the cabin. Kyle looked up and smiled at me. He seemed much more relaxed. Good. As we were leaving the mess hall, I pulled Jonathan aside. "What do you know about the burnt place?" He chuckled. "Same thing everyone else knows. It's a death trap that they can't get rid of because the area is so overgrown." "Why?" "Because, What could I say? Because earlier today, a camper had had the crap scared out of them there. Because it was linked to Kate's disappearance that her blood had led me to it. Couldn't really say that to the guy who told me to stop looking into her. Because there's some weird stuff going on here. He briefly rolled his eyes. No, don't do that. You invited me here. You can't just shrug away my concerns. Come on, John. His lip curled up in a half smile. You're right. I'm sorry. Tell you what, how about this Saturday when we go into town? We get lunch together and talk about everything. I know a great restaurant too. I was happily surprised. That'd be perfect. As we went back into our cabins, I was already making a mental list of all the things I wanted to ask. On Friday, we finished climbing early, and I stopped by the skate park to see Jonathan. He was handing out little wrenches as a keepsake to each of the campers, and he grinned when he saw me. Who wants to see me do one last trick? The campers cheered, and Jonathan grabbed his board and ran onto the park. He hopped on and skated around in circles, picking up speed before heading up a ramp. He stopped at the top, balancing his board on the edge for a few seconds, and then dropped back down. Now, moving even faster, he headed to the ramp on the other side, this one a good 6 feet tall. He flew up it and into the air, where he spun around 180 degrees and dropped back down. The campers shouted and clapped. I joined in. I had no idea Jonathan was so good at this. He curved around, now speeding to a series of rails. Just as he reached the first one, his board suddenly stopped and jackknifed up, causing Jonathan to fly forward and crash headfirst into the railing. He hadn't been wearing a helmet, something I only realized as I heard the impact of bone on iron. He was taken to the hospital an hour later after the other counselors and I had tried to calm down the terrified campers and get help from the infirmary, and from what I heard, he has multiple broken bones and a severe concussion. After he was whisked away, I inspected the place where his board had suddenly crashed. A rusty nail was jutting out about an inch. His board must have caught it in the exact worst place. And now, as I sit in this restaurant alone, I'm trying to tell myself that this injury is just a coincidence. People get hurt at camp all the time, but I'm really not sure if I buy it. Kate's disappearance, Nathan's fearful encounter, Jonathan's injury. The shit at Yaniwana is getting weirder and weirder. And now I'm stuck here, all alone. This week, I was assigned a cabin of 10-year-olds, but due to there being extra counselors on hand, and also the fact that 10-year-old boys are monsters, I was paired with a co-counselor, Kyle. I was pretty excited when I found out. I hadn't had a whole lot of time to talk to him about what had happened with Nathan the week prior, but now we'd be spending the week together in close quarters, which would give us plenty of time to discuss what was going on. I initially thought that our pairing had been by chance, but on Sunday evening, after all activities were done, Donald asked me to come to his cabin before I went back to mine. His cabin was actually a real one, with doors and windows and a double bed with an actual mattress. I knew Donald tended to come up to Yaniwana in early spring and stay until the snow started to fall in the winter, so it made sense that he'd turned it into a living space. He invited me to take a seat and then walked to the small fridge along the back wall. Would you like a drink? He opened it to reveal about a dozen bottles of water, as well as a few cans of pop. I passed, but my eyes were drawn to a cross, attached to a line of beads, that hung just above the fridge. I motioned to it. Is that a rosary? I wasn't Catholic, but I had enough friends who were to recognize it. He laughed. Don't tell anyone. It was my grandfather's, and I like to keep it around. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and sat down on the bed, opposite me. I just wanted to talk to you briefly about Kyle. Keep an eye on him, will you? He's a good kid, and I know he's trying his best. It's just that. That what? I asked. Donald grimaced. I can't say. I can't put it into words. Just keep an eye on him, okay? I shrugged. Sure thing. I got up to leave, and as I did, I noticed 2 boxes of salt on the shelf next to the door. A midnight snack? I asked. Another laugh. For the winter, when everything freezes. Not easy to walk around icy paths. I left his cabin and went back to my own. Kyle was struggling to get all the campers into their bunks, but my presence seemed to get them to obey. He led them in a brief Bible study and then turned off the lights, but sleep didn't come easily for anyone in that cabin. The boys were up till nearly midnight, talking about Minecraft and Fortnite, and once I did fall asleep, morning came quickly. Even though Kyle and I were now living literally feet from each other, I had a hard time getting him alone to talk about what was happening at this camp. We taught different activities during the day, and when we were in the cabin, there was always at least one camper with us. Not exactly the opportune time to bring up something that had traumatized a boy the previous week. But I knew something was on Kyle's mind at meals, and in the cabin, I'd frequently catch him looking at me with a twinge of concern. What did he know? And how could we use it to figure out what was going on here? Finally, on Tuesday evening, my camper's supply of 10-year-old energy was finally depleted, and they were all asleep by 9:30. I was on my phone, typing out the above, when Kyle quietly got up and sat down on my bed. We exchanged a few words about how the week was going, and which camper was the smelliest, Gavin, obviously, before I got to the real issue, and asked him what Nathan had said after Donald had calmed him down. Nothing, Kyle said. It was hard to tell from his voice whether he saw this as a good or bad thing. I asked him several times what he'd seen. He just said he got lost and scared, and was afraid he'd never be found in the woods. It was a decent explanation. I looked around the darkened cabin at each of the sleeping boys. At that age, imagination can run wild. Maybe that's all that happened. But I don't believe it, Kyle continued. There's something weird going on here. Something not of this world. He paused. Do you believe in demons? I wasn't sure. Probably not. There had to be a rational explanation for everything that had happened. But a girl I liked had disappeared, and a place reeking of sulfur had been involved, and now I finally had a friend who would be willing to investigate it with me. I nodded, though in the dark, I don't know if he could see. Of course, then we need to go back to the burnt place, Kyle said, and actually check it out. Look for clues or something. Or a sign of the demonic, sure. But when? If we go during the day, someone could see us. Donald had driven home how off limits the burnt place was, and given what had happened with Nathan, he probably viewed me and Kyle with extra suspicion. Then let's go at night, Kyle said. We have flashlights and no one will notice that we're not in the cabin. We'll do it tomorrow. I really wasn't sure what a night trip to the burnt place would accomplish, but if it helped Kyle calm down, I was all for it. I agreed, and the next evening, we made a big show of telling the campers how tired we were as we got ready for bed. I fell asleep pretty quickly, and what felt like minutes later, I was pushed awake by Kyle. What time is it? I asked groggily. I'd set a quiet alarm on my phone for 3 a.m. 2:30, he replied. He sounded fully awake. Given how jumpy he'd been during the day, it wouldn't have surprised me if he'd been up the whole time. Let's go. I got changed into my darkest clothes, the same I'd worn when I'd made the trip to Kate's cabin 3 weeks ago, and we grabbed our flashlights. I had a small one with a decent beam. He had the spotlight kind that could light up an entire field. We decided to use mine to start. We left the cabin and moved across the field, towards the main lodge. The air was crisp, and there was no sign of anyone around. We reached the lodge and found the path behind it. Using both of our lights, we slowly made our way through the path, me leading the way. I could hear Kyle breathing heavily, panting, almost as we traversed. I didn't blame him. The forest was pitch black, with no light, but that from our lights, and even his high-powered one could go no more than a few feet into the trees. Every noise, no matter how faint, caused me to jump. I realized that I was completely at the mercy of my imagination, and my brain was coming up with some horribly creative ideas of what lurked just beyond the path. As scary as it was, it did help explain Nathan's state of mind when we'd found him. Maybe he was just really, really scared. After a minute of walking, I detected the sulfuric smell again. Kyle emitted a small whimper. Neither of us said anything more, but we pressed on. The scent became stronger, to the point where my nostrils felt like they were burning. I told myself it was a good thing. We were close. The path finally ended, and we walked out into the clearing. Both of our lights focused on the rubble in the middle. Kyle took several deep breaths. I tried to, but my lungs would only allow me short, shallow ones. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was actually scared. I shook my head and tried to push it from my mind. It was the darkness. It was playing with my head. We moved around the wreckage in opposite ways. I really wasn't sure what we were looking for. I hadn't seen anything when I'd found this place 2 weeks prior. But I told myself that maybe this would be good for Kyle. Maybe if we didn't find anything, it would put his fears to rest. Oh God, or maybe not. Kyle was leaning over some of the twisted steel, looking in on the center of the debris. He waved his hand at me. Kill your light. I did so, and he did the same. Oh fuck. Oh fuck no. What? I asked. I walked over to him and looked in. Oh, my breath was involuntarily drawn out of me, like I'd been hit in the stomach. I closed my eyes and opened them, just to be sure I was seeing it. There was no doubt. In the middle of the burnt place were glowing red coals. Needing proof that they were real, I ran to the closest tree, tore off a stick, and ran back. I held the stick up to one of the coals. After a few seconds, it began to smoke and glow slightly. I quickly dropped it. An audible sob came from Kyle as he slowly sat down, bringing his knees up to his chest and wrapping his arms around them, not unlike how we'd found Nathan. It's real, he said. There's a demon here, and it's my fault. It's all my fault. Whoa, 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 I said. I sat down next to him, but facing the opposite directions of his legs, so that I could look directly at him. We don't know that there's a demon, but even if there is, it wasn't because of you. Yes, it is. He raised his head up. His face was streaked with tears. I brought it here. I should have stayed away. Oh God, I'm sorry. I flipped around so that I was on my knees. I put both my hands on his shoulders and looked right into his eyes, just inches from mine. Kyle, listen to me. You had nothing to do with any of this. We're going to figure out what is causing all of this, but there has to be a logic. And then he kissed me. He sat up, put his lips against mine, and kissed me. Honestly, my first thought was, oh, damn, now we're going to get kicked out of camp. But after the surprise had worn off, I pulled my head back and pushed him away slightly, while keeping my hands on him. A million thoughts filled my head, but overriding all of them was an incredible amount of sympathy for this kid. I'm sorry. His voice was barely a whisper. I shouldn't have done that. No, it's okay. I mean, I wasn't into him, but it wasn't a big deal. I won't tell anyone or anything. It's all my fault, he said again. His body was shaking. There's this evil inside me. Satan has me. And I brought him here in the darkness. I hoped he couldn't see the 10 different ways my face was twisting. Do you mean? I struggled to figure out what he was saying. You think you brought a demon here because you're gay? He tried to pull back, but I wasn't letting go of him. I'm not gay, he said through gritted teeth. I have a demon giving me these thoughts. That's what's been causing all of this. Jesus. Where to even begin? There's nothing wrong with you, I said. And if you're gay or bi or whatever, it's not because of a demon. My nose had caught scent of something aside from the sulfur. Something much more familiar. Smoke. I let go of Kyle and stood up. Beyond the darkened forest, I could see flickers of light coming from the girls' cabins. Shit. I turned my flashlight back on and ran into the woods. I took multiple branches to the face and hands, but with the sheer amount of fear coursing through my blood, I hardly noticed. I burst out of the path and had my fears confirmed. One of the cabins was on fire. The tarps covering the door and both windows were burning in large orange flames. Worse yet, no one seemed to have noticed. I sprinted down the hill towards the flames, screaming fire at the top of my lungs. After a few seconds, lights began to turn on in the other cabins. Then a chorus of screams erupted from the burning one. I reached it and felt the heat from the flames. Stay calm. We're going to get you out of there. There had to be a fire extinguisher nearby. I shone my flashlight around. Come on, where is it? I tried not to think about how scared the girls in the burning cabin had to be. No, I was going to get them out. I had to. At last, I found the red canister next to one of the other cabins. I grabbed it, pulled out the pin, and sprayed down the tarps on the door. The flames went out enough that I was able to grab onto one and pull it back. I looked into the cabin to see a half-dozen girls in their counselor huddle in the back, as flames burned along the windows on either side of them. Let's go, I shouted. Hurry. I didn't have to tell them twice. They all ran through the cabin and out the opening in the door. Once they were out, I did my best to spray down the flaps on the side. Fortunately, the actual cabin hadn't caught fire, and after Donald and Beth arrived with extra extinguishers, the flames were put out for good. As Beth tried to calm down the campers, Donald took me aside. He asked me what had happened and, with a bit of a wry grin, what I was doing there. Given that I hadn't seen Kyle since I'd run from him at the burnt place, I figured it was safe to lie. I said I'd gotten up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and when I smelled smoke, I had run to the girls' section to investigate it. Donald seemed to buy it, but he kept looking at my clothes, my dark pants and shirt. Oops. Eventually, I went back to my cabin. Kyle was in his bed, turned toward the wall. I whispered his name, but either he was asleep or didn't want to talk to me. For the rest of the week, he kept his distance, refusing to talk about what had happened at the burnt place and keeping campers around so that I couldn't bring anything up in front of them. Meanwhile, it felt like Donald had his eyes on me at every meal and camp-wide activity. I heard from the camp grapevine that the smoke detectors in the cabin had been tampered with, allowing the fire to grow without anyone knowing. I kept quiet about finding the coals. It would only go to make me look even more suspicious. Though honestly, at this point, I don't really care. I'm ready to go home. There's just too much weird shit going on, and whether it's a demon or Dracula or whatever, I'm done with it. A job at Swiss Chalet would be far better than this. So if any of you can make a trip up to Name of Town Removed, please email me by 3 today. If not, guess I'm in for another week at Yanewana. I'll let you know what happens. Yick know if I survive. Well, none of y'all emailed me before I got on the bus to go back to camp. So this week, I was placed in the oldest cabin group. I had a bunch of 14-year-olds to look after. I'm not sure if Donald had taken pity on me or what, but it turns out that age group is as chill as they come. They just wanted to lie around and listen to Drake and do as little as possible, and I was more than happy to oblige them. None of them noticed how stressed I must have looked, especially for the first few days. Also, Kyle's gone. The last I saw him was Saturday morning, after all our campers had left. He had already packed all his things up as I came back to the cabin. He told me he enjoyed working with me, wished me luck, gave me a pat on the shoulder, and walked out. It was the last time I saw him. He wasn't at the staff lunch on Sunday, and at this point, I knew better than to ask. Still, it gave me one more thing to think about as I lay in my bunk for hours in the hot cabin. This week was warm at easily mid-30s with the humidex, and while it made the cold lake super inviting, it also made everything else really uncomfortable. Teaching rock climbing or playing capture the flag under the hot sun was not fun at all, and nights weren't much better. It took me a while to fall asleep, no matter how tired I was. But I'm burying the lead here. Amongst the group of teen boys in my cabin was Ian. And though that initially meant nothing to me, it clearly was a big deal to all the other counselors. It seemed like multiple times at every meal, someone would come up and ask how he was doing. I'd say fine, and they'd go on about how awesome he is, and how lucky I was to have him in my cabin. I couldn't figure out why. He was just like all the other boys, maybe a bit skinnier, and with a little less acne, but otherwise just as lazy and sarcastic and obsessed with girls. The first few days were uneventful. Rumors of what had caused the fire the previous week were spreading quickly, and Donald and Beth weren't doing anything to help. At our staff lunch on Sunday, they had told us that a fire marshal would be investigating it, and if any of us knew anything that we should talk to them. Beth seemed frightened and Donald seemed angry. Neither of them seemed to have a firm grasp of what was going on. But beyond that, there was nothing more I learned about the burnt place or Kate, and now Kyle's disappearance. I saw this as my final week at Yaniwan, as surely someone would be able to get me next Saturday, and what better way to spend it than by involving myself as little as possible. But then, Wednesday night, I had a nightmare. I was back at the burnt place. The forest around me was on fire, and I could hear screams coming from the middle of the rubble. I walked over and found Kate lying among burning embers, shouting for help. I tried to reach her, but I couldn't get over the debris. As I watched, the hooded figure appeared beside her. It held its razor-sharp claws up and then plunged them into her stomach. I woke up drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. I checked my phone too, 16 a.m. I was now wide awake. Great. A light came on me from above. Bad dream? It was Ian. He leaned over his top bunk opposite mine. Yeah, I whispered. Did I wake you? He pointed his light to the book in his other hand. Nah. I don't sleep a whole lot, right? I needed to get out of the cabin and calm my mind down. I'm going for a walk, I said. Wanna come? Sure. He climbed down from his bunk. I put on some shorts and we both went outside. It wasn't any cooler out of the cabin, but there was at least a bit of a breeze. I headed toward the field. Ian walked along, his headlamp lighting the path in front of us. So do you just not sleep, or what? I asked. He shrugged. I never really needed a lot of sleep. Guess it's just one more way my body's screwed up. I give him a quick up and down. Looks fine to me. He laughed, and then gave me a bit of a look. Do you not know about me? Only that everyone here seems to think you're the coolest person in the world. I grinned at him. Why they think that is beyond me. He jabbed at me with his elbow. But really, what's your story? We came to a stop in the middle of the field. Thousands of stars twinkled in the dark sky above us, while a crescent moon hung just above the lake. I used to have cancer. Leukemia. Shit. The word was out of my mouth before I could stop myself. I mean, darn. Yeah. I've heard worse. But I had it from ages 10 to 13. Everyone here knew, obviously. I guess they see me as some kind of hero, because I got through it. I don't blame them. I can't even imagine what that would have been like. The biggest health scare I'd ever had was breaking my wrist when I was 11. And I had cried like a baby. It sucked. He laughed. Like, so much. I couldn't move, couldn't eat, could barely talk. And it went on for months. In the last 4 years, I honestly think I've spent more time in the hospital than anywhere else. And the nurses weren't even hot, and now I was starting to see why everyone liked this kid. He was cool. But God got me through it. I prayed so much when I was getting treatments, and I know it worked. Even when I couldn't move and I was throwing up every 5 minutes, I know he was right next to me. He gave me strength the entire time. That's awesome. I'm glad our faith got you through it. God is good. We walked down the field to the lake. God is good, Ian echoed. But it's still scary. Any time I feel pain in my body or I get sick, I think, damn, it's back again. And the nightmares I've had. I'm always back in the hospital, hooked up to all these wires, about to die. I guess it's a good thing I don't have to sleep a whole lot. Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm glad you're better now. Thanks. We reached one of the docks. The soft sound of the water rippled in front of us. My body still felt incredibly warm as I stared out at the water. If I were to jump in, would you tell anyone? He shook his head. I stripped down to my boxers, walked to the end of the dock, and lightly hopped in. The cold, dark water enveloped me. I went under and slowly exhaled, allowing my body to sink down deeper. After a few seconds, my feet touched the grimy bottom. I opened my eyes. Nothing but pure blackness. This was the most peaceful I'd felt in weeks. I pushed off of the mud and surfaced. My body temp had dropped a good 10 degrees. I climbed back onto the dock. I hope you didn't run off with clothes. No response. Ian, where are you? I walked back onto the grass and looked around. My clothes were still lying in a pile, but my camper was nowhere to be found. Shit. I rifled through my clothes, trying to find my flashlight, only to remember that I hadn't brought it with me. Where the hell was he? Had he gone back to the cabin? He wouldn't have. And I was only underwater for a few seconds. He wouldn't have been able to run from the field that quickly. So then what had happened? Had something gotten him? I called out his name again, and then again, my voice breaking. Nothing. My legs gave way and I fell to my knees. Hot tears started to form in my eyes. Fuck. Kate, Jonathan, Kyle, and now Ian. And it was my fault. We should have stayed in the cabin, shouldn't have come out here in the middle of the night, shouldn't have left him alone while I jumped in the lake. Hey, Ian walked out from the forest just north of the dock. Are you okay? Relief poured over me. Oh, thank God, I said. Where were you? What happened? I was taking a leak, he said slowly. Sorry if I scared you. No, I'm fine. I put my clothes back on. I was still wet, but I'd manage. Come on, let's go back to the cabin. We started walking back through the field in silence. As we neared the cabins, Ian quietly said, "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone else? Not because it's bad or anything, it's just a bit weird." I stopped so that we wouldn't wake anyone. Of course, he took a breath. There were points when I was in the hospital where I honestly thought I was about to die. Like, I could feel my body just shutting down and giving up. And when I did, I saw something. It was like I was being transported there. Heaven? He shook his head. No, he said, even quieter. I saw this place. I closed my eyes and I was back at camp. And I remember thinking, this is okay. I could stay here. It was. It was peaceful. My eyes felt itchy again. I put an arm around his shoulder and pulled him close to me. That's really special. This camp is special, he said. And it's because of you. I kept him pulled against me. We stood there in silence for another minute, but this time I broke it. I think a demon is attacking this camp. I'm not sure why I said it. Ian had been so forthcoming with me, and I guess I figured if there was anyone I could trust, it was him. He said, I remember a counselor telling me a few years ago that a demon was causing my cancer. That's some bullshit right there. Yeah. Everyone here has this weird fascination with demons and Satan and whatnot, and you don't. He gently pulled away from my half-hug. You know, they could be real, but God's stronger than them. That's one thing I am certain of. He looked right up at me. Why do you think it's a demon? What the hell? I gave him a quick explanation of what I had experienced at Yaniwana in particular, the strangeness of the burnt place, the cabin catching fire, and, of course, Kate's disappearance. When I had finished, Ian scoffed. So all of this is because a girl you like mysteriously vanished from camp? Why don't you just call her to find out what happened? He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I can't. I don't know her number. Did you even look? Like, I don't know, the med center? Of fucking course. It would have everyone's medical forms, which would include their contact info. You're right, I said. I'll have to sneak in there sometime. Screw that. Let's go now. He had a massive, devilish grin on his face. How could I resist? We went back across the field again, this time to the main lodge. The med station was attached to it a small clinic that could fit about 5 people. So far this summer, I'd only been there twice, at the beginning of the summer, to drop off my forms, and 2 weeks earlier, when a camper had been stung by a wasp at the climbing wall. The station was locked, obviously, but Ian suggested I push hard on the door, and lo and behold it opened. It's been like this for years, he said. We walked in through the tiny waiting area and into the main room, which had large cabinets on either side, filled with what I'm sure was medicines and equipment. Ian shone his light at one of the drawers. It's probably in here. He grabbed it and yanked it open, revealing dozens of hanging folders, each with a different name on the tab. Using his light, I worked through them, trying to find Kate's. It was at the very back, and it held about 10 different sheets. It occurred to me that I was being super invasive, that this was her private medical information, so I looked through to find her contact info, and nothing else. It was second from the top, with her cell number about a third of the way down. Ian pointed to the back wall. Phone's right there. I rushed over, picked up it, and dialed Kate's number. As it rang, I asked myself exactly what I was expecting. It was the middle of the night. Would someone pick up? Would I have to leave a message? What would I say? I couldn't hello, oh fuck. It was her voice. Groggy and confused, but it was Kate. Is someone there? Kate, the words sputtered out of me. My heart was threatening to break right out of my chest. What? Oh God, she recognized me. I was sure of it. Why are you calling me in the middle of the night? I'm sorry, I wanted shit. What was I calling for? I hadn't actually thought she'd pick up. Are you okay? There was heavy breathing on the end of the line. You shouldn't have called, she finally said. I thought someone would have told you that. They did. Light caught my eye out the back window. It looked like a flashlight. I pushed myself to the wall, looked at Ian and pointed to my forehead. Ian turned off his headlamp. I was concerned about you. The light briefly shone directly in the window. I nearly dropped the receiver. I'm sorry, Kate said. I didn't mean to concern you, but I can't talk to you right now. I can't talk to anyone from camp. Goodbye. Wait, I started, but she'd already hung up. Fuck, my head dropped as I put the phone back. I'm sorry, Ian said. It's fine. My head was spinning with thoughts, but overpowering all of them was a desire to get out of the med station. Come on. We gotta go, again. The light from outside briefly flashed through the window. I quickly put the pages back in the folder and closed the cabinet. We crept out of the station and closed the door, but I put my arm out and held Ian back before we could go across the field. Whoever was behind the lodge with the flashlight could easily see us. We waited silently for a good 5 minutes before I saw light come from around the building. I held my breath as the person walked up and into Donald's cabin. Donald? What was he doing out in the middle of the night? Probably taking a leak too. Yaniwana's washroom facilities really needed some upgrading. With Donald back in his cabin, Ian and I ran back through the field. Halfway across, I stopped him. You tired yet? He wasn't. Me neither. And the sky sure is nice tonight. Would be a shame to not appreciate it. He laughed, and we lay down on the grass, looking up at the stars. It was gorgeous. There were numerous shooting stars, going across the glowing Milky Way directly above us. We stayed out there for another hour before I felt myself dozing off, and then we trudged back to the cabin and quickly fell asleep. Earlier today, I said goodbye to Ian, hugging him tighter than I've hugged anyone in a long time and telling him that he could always count on me as a friend. Not gonna lie, I shed a few tears as he drove off. The other staff were right. He's a really special kid. I now have 3 weeks left here and about 1,000,000 questions to answer. The fact that Kate is alive is relieving, but I still have no idea what happened to her or why she wouldn't talk to me. And the mysteries surrounding the burnt place are only getting more confusing. Could this be something supernatural? It's still hard to wrap my mind around it. I just don't know. But here's what I do know. This camp means something to so many people, including a 14-year-old cancer survivor. Before he left, and after I had finished squeezing his frail little body, he asked me if I was going to figure out what was going on. I promised I would, and it's a promise I intend to keep. I have 3 weeks left here, and I will be staying until the end. So for those who emailed me asking if I needed a ride home, I don't anymore. I have a mystery to solve, and demon or not, damn it if I'm not going to try. Hard to believe it's already the 2nd week of August. There are just 3 weeks left at Yaniwana. And honestly, you can kind of feel it here. The counselors are looking a bit more tired. Everyone's patience is wearing a bit thinner, and tensions between everyone seem to be rising. Of course, that could also be because things are getting batshit crazy here. While last week kept me occupied with Ian and a bunch of chill bros, apparently not everyone had as relaxing a week. At Sunday's staff lunch, I found out that one of the girls' counselors had woken up in the middle of the night and noticed that one of her campers wasn't in her bunk. She thought the kid had gone to the bathroom, so she went back to sleep, but about an hour later, she and the rest of the cabin were awoken by the same girl, now back in her bunk, and screaming in fear. It took Beth all night to calm her down, and she wouldn't say what had upset her. It's being kept in hushed whispers, but the word demon is getting used more and more frequently around here. At first, it was the super fundamentalist types like Jordan, but from what I've heard from the female rock climbing instructors, everyone's on edge about some paranormal attack. It hasn't helped that 2 of the 3 cabins that were struck by the burnt claw earlier this summer have had weird things happen to them. One had the fire I put out 2 weeks ago. The other had the terrified camper. The third was mysteriously taken out of use this week, though whether that was due to Beth and Donald believing in a potential demonic attack or simply because no girl staff member would agree to live in it is beyond me. Anyways, let's get to my week. I had another cabin of 12-year-olds this week, and honestly, I'm so good with that age group that I should consider starting my own business revolving around helping parents through their kids' preteen years. Also, I've learned that you can say "big oof" to anything, and it's considered an acceptable response. Very cool. As the campers were arriving this week, one of the moms took me aside and told me that her son, Adam, still had a bit of a bedwetting problem and asked if he could have the bed closest to the door, in case he had to make a quick dash to the bathroom at night. That bed happens to be the counselor's bed. It's a bit bigger, and is the only one in the cabin without a bunk above it, but I was fine to let him use it. I took the bed at the back corner and had no issue leading my patented Bible-esque studies at night. I have to say, I felt a weight off my shoulders as the week started. Actually talking to Kate on the phone and knowing that she was alive was a huge relief for me, even if it was coupled with burning questions about what the hell had happened to her and why she refused to talk to me. And it's given me a new purpose: find out what's going on at the burnt place without arousing any further suspicion from Donald. Tuesday afternoon, I was resting in my bunk while the campers were off playing on a huge, soapy tarp in the middle of the field. There was a knock on the cabin as Jordan walked in. He looked confused. "Why are you on a camper's bed?" he asked as he sat down on Adam's. "'Cause the one you're sitting on is being used by a bedwetter," I smirked. I thought it would make him stand back up, but he just smirked back. "Finally have one, huh? Just don't be surprised if you find a few wet diapers under his bunk at the end of the week." I shuddered slightly. "So, what's up?" "I have something for you." He opened his hand, revealing a thin black rope with a white cross hanging off of it. "I've been praying a lot about everything happening here, and today God kept saying your name to me. I'm not sure exactly what he meant, but I figured you could use this. Thanks." I got up and took the necklace. The rope was smooth, and the cross was perfectly polished. I put it on. "It's made from South African stone," he continued. "I got it when I did a missions trip there in the winter. There was something about it that really attracted me." "You sure you don't need it yourself?" I asked. While his reasons for giving it to me were rather strange, it was nevertheless a very kind gesture. He smiled. "I'm good." Jordan grabbed his collar and pulled it down into his left, revealing a sizable cross tattoo over his chest. "Just stay vigilant, okay? The enemy is ramping up his attacks against us, and I think God has a purpose for you in all this." He left, and I slipped the necklace under my shirt. I didn't want to have to explain it to anyone. Gotta admit, though, I was touched by it. Jordan was weird, even by Yaniwana standards, but he obviously cared about the camp and the people in it. I kept the cross under my shirt for the rest of the day and the next, being reminded of it every so often, as I felt the cool stone against my skin. I considered taking it off at night, but decided to keep it on given the weird things that had been happening when the sun went down. It was probably when I needed the cross the most. Turns out I was right. The night after Jordan had given me the necklace, I once again woke up and found myself staring at the robed figure, now standing in the middle of the cabin. It towered over the bunks, its back hunched and its hooded head bent over. I slowly looked up until my eyes met the lifeless hole where its face should have been. As they did, I was overwhelmed with the smell of sulfur, as though it were all around me and inside every inch of my body. I wanted to shrink back in fear, to try to disappear into the mattress again and wait for the thing to leave. Then I felt the piercing cold white stone against my chest. The cross. I clutched it in my hand and kept my eyes on the hood. The figure showed no reaction. The sulfuric stench was so strong, I was on the verge of gagging. With my free hand, I grabbed my flashlight, pointed it at the figure, and turned it on. I heard something like a guttural cry, and then the cabin was empty. The thing was gone, as was the stench. What the fuck? I muttered to myself as my body relaxed. It was short-lived with the robed figure gone. My flashlight was now shining on Adam's bed. His empty bed. I jumped out of my sleeping bag and swept my light around the cabin. All the other boys were still asleep in their bunks. Only Adam was gone. He could have gone to the bathroom. That was the reason he had the bed closest to the door, after all. But after what had happened the week before at the girls' cabins, I had to be sure. I quickly threw my clothes and shoes on and walked outside and towards the bathroom. I inhaled sharply as I saw that there were no lights on inside, and my walk picked up into a jog. I went into the bathroom, triggering the automatic lights to come on, and called out Adam's name. Nothing. Shit. I left the bathroom and briskly walked back to the cabins, shining my light around the surrounding trees and bushes. Despite our frequent condemnations of it, campers loved to use nature to relieve themselves, even when a bathroom was 50 feet away. I called out for Adam again, and then again. There was no sign of him. My heart was racing, and my breath was incredibly short. Fuck. Where was he? Had something happened to him? I ran through the area, weaving around the cabins, looking for any sign of him. Not a thing. Not again. I heard the sound of flaps rustling and turned to see Jordan sticking his head out of his cabin. Are you okay? I shook my head. One of my campers is missing. He flinched. We should get Donald. I really wanted to agree. It was the sensible thing to do. But I hesitated, and Jordan obviously noticed. Why don't you want to get him? His voice was less accusatory and more curious. Because I think I know where he is, I said. And Donald won't believe me. He stepped back into his cabin. Half a minute later, he stepped back out, fully dressed and holding a flashlight. Let's go. We moved quickly from the cabins, going across the field to the main lodge. We kept our lights off until we were behind the lodge. I found the path in seconds. Despite the urgency, I paused as I took the first step into the dark, overgrown path. What exactly were we about to confront? This wasn't like previous visits, where I was going during the day or for investigation. This time, I was expecting to find someone there. And maybe not alone. I looked over at Jordan, who nodded at me. I stepped into the path, walking slowly and as quietly as I could. Could demons hear? Or would they just sense my presence? Shit. I was actually asking myself these questions. Deep down inside, I clearly believed that I was going up against something beyond this world. And evil at that. After about a minute of walking, the smell hit us. We shared a glance, but said nothing. I was breathing like I just ran a marathon. I tried to distract myself with thinking about how the last time I had been here, Kyle had tried to kiss me, and wouldn't it be funny if Jordan had done the same? Ha ha ha, 'cause he's so religious, right? And he wasn't that bad-looking of a guy, and I sure had a tendency to stick it in crazy, and from deeper in the forest came the cracking of sticks. I froze and had to cover my mouth to keep from screaming. I shone my light in the direction of the noise, but of course it didn't reveal anything but a few tree trunks. I turned back and kept going. Every step felt like climbing a mountain. My head was light, and my heart pounding so hard, I was afraid the demon or whatever it was would hear it. Damn it, what the hell was I doing? We'd gone another minute, and probably taken all of 20 steps, when a loud screech came from what I think was the direction of the burnt place. It was like a wounded, angry animal crying out. Then came more sticks breaking in the darkness. Oh, what the fuck? What in the ever-loving fuck? Jordan was suddenly right behind me. Pray, he said. In a louder voice, he said, I know you're out there, evil one, and in the name of Jesus, I command you to leave. Why, yes, I added, my voice shaking so much more than his. God save us. Our Father in heaven. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. He was singing now. Early in the morning our songs shall rise to thee. God in three persons, blessed Trinity. I felt a small sense of relief and found the strength to keep going. As I took small, slow steps through the bumpy path, I grabbed the cross around my neck and tried to recall any Bible verse that I could quote. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lieth in greenest pastures. It felt like we had been walking for an hour. Where was the burnt place? I tried to remember the path's layout from my previous journeys, but at this point, it felt as unfamiliar as it had ever been. 5 steps. A turn. Another 10 steps. Another bend. Jordan singing hymns behind me. Movement in the trees beyond us. I had to keep going. The stench of the sulfur was becoming overwhelming as I went around one more curve. My shaking flashlight revealed the end of the trees just up ahead. Finally, I grabbed Jordan's hand because there was no fucking chance I could take those last few steps on my own, and pressed ahead. 20 feet, 10 feet, 5, and then we were out of the woods and in the clearing. We both shone our lights around, looking for Adam I hoped or a demon I feared. We saw neither, just the ruins, which now seemed bigger and more twisted in its place. I simultaneously felt relief and fear. If no one was here, what had been making those noises? And where was my camper? I let go of Jordan's hand and slowly walked around the debris, as I had in my past visits. Jordan stayed with me, but kept his light on the forest behind us, as though he were expecting something to jump out at us at any second. It was a possibility. I walked around the corner, my light still shining on the burnt place, and my eyes never leaving it. It was only in my peripheral vision that I caught a sock on the grass, close to the forest's edge. I swung my light to it. Oh, my fuck! A meter away from the sock, laying in the grass, was Adam. I dashed over and fell on my knees next to his body. Adam, are you okay? He didn't respond. In the darkness, I couldn't tell if he was even still breathing. Oh God. No, 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 no. I put my fingers on his neck, trying to find his pulse. Fuck, fuck, fuck. I took first aid. I had to find it, but why couldn't I? My vision became blurry as tears streamed down my face. Please God, no, don't let this happen. I'd never forgive myself. Not if I could have stopped this thing. My fingers went under his jaw, and I felt a steady pulse. Oh, thank fuck. I put my hand over his mouth and felt his faint breath against it. Good. I gently put my hand on his cheek and shook his head. Hey, Adam? You with us? He slowly stirred and opened his eyes. What happened? He asked groggily. He shifted around, noticing the dew on his pajamas. Oh no, did I wet the bed? I looked back at Jordan. Not exactly. Do you know where you are right now? He sat up and looked around. This isn't the cabin. Where are we? Was I pranked? You're in the middle of the forest, I said. He gave me a blank look. Do you remember coming here? He looked around again. Is this a dream? I don't. I thought I was in bed. No recollection. That was ultimately a good thing, even if it provided me with no explanation. Jordan spoke up. We should get back to the cabins. These parts aren't safe at night, understatement of the summer. I stood up and helped my camper to his feet. Given that he had no shoes, I offered him a piggyback ride. He climbed on my back, and we started toward the path. As we did, I saw a bright light moving within the forest, along with the sound of cracking branches. I pointed my flashlight in its direction and clenched my free hand into a fist. If this thing wanted my camper, it was going to have to go through me first. The light got closer and closer as I readied myself for a fight. Amazing how quickly fear vanished when I had a kid to protect. Finally, it reached the clearing, and Donald burst out from the trees. He looked from me to Jordan and back to me again as his jaw dropped. "What are you guys doing here?" I pointed to the camper on my back. "We found him here." Donald's eyes went wide. What was he doing here? Our silence made it clear that there was no answer. Probably sleepwalking, I bet. We often have campers who do that, especially if they have other sleeping issues too. I felt bad for Adam, but if using his bedwetting against him worked, so be it. Now let's go. You all should be in bed. We walked up to him, and he led us back down the path. As we went, I noticed that he had the rosary I'd seen hanging in his cabin wrapped around his hand. I wanted to ask about it, but I feared that any question I'd propose would be met with some of his own, such as why I was at the burnt place in the middle of the night, or how I'd known Adam would be there. I was exhausted the next day, but Adam was as lively and spirited as he'd been before. Whatever events had taken place that had resulted in him ending up at the burnt place, he sure as hell didn't remember them, and there weren't any physical marks or bruises on him. Plus, either he'd bought Donald's story about sleepwalking, or he was too dazed to remember everything, because he didn't again mention what had happened that night. Thank God. I only had a chance to speak to Donald once after that night. He was absent from half the meals and nearly all the activities, and when I approached him to talk about what had happened, he simply said, "Not now. We'll talk soon." On the bright side, though, I now have Jordan squarely in my corner. He's been checking in on me multiple times a day and even came into my cabin to pray with my campers on the final night. And he's scheduled an impromptu meeting with any interested staff for tonight to discuss everything that's happened. Speaking of which, I need to get back to the bus. So that's this week's update. I've got 2 weeks left to figure what the hell is going on here. I just really hope it isn't what I think it is. Right after I sent my last email, I got back on the bus and went back to Yaniwana. I had dinner leftovers from the week before. Quite a crapshoot, but this time it was pretty good. And then I went to Jordan's cabin for the emergency meeting he had called. I was joined by about 10 other counselors, making our group just under a quarter of all the staff. Not bad. Once we were all there, Jordan spoke. "Thank you all for coming. I invited each of you here because you've all expressed concern with what's been going on here this summer. We all suspect that there may be a demonic presence at camp. After last week, I'm sure of it." He looked right at me. I wasn't sure if he wanted me to speak up and confirm it. I stayed quiet, and he kept talking. "The leaders here don't seem to care about it. Or if they do, they sure as heck aren't showing it. That leaves it up to us to stop this thing, and how do we do that?" One of the girls asked. "Twice this summer, my campers have gone missing in the middle of the night, only to be back in their bunks in the morning with no recollection of where they went." A few others nodded in agreement. I bit my lip to keep from cursing aloud. I didn't know it was that bad. If this is spiritual warfare, how do we fight it? Jordan reached over to his bunk and grabbed a paperback book. I couldn't read the title, but the cover had fire and pentagrams on it. I found this in a bookstore in town. It's basically a guide on how to fight off demons, like an exorcism? I asked. No, exorcisms are for possessions. and are also a load of bull. He threw the book back on his bed. I'll read through it tonight. Let's make plans to attack this thing on Tuesday. That's 3 days from now, one of the girls said. What do we do until then? This thing isn't going to wait for us. We protect our campers, I said. The idea was forming in my head as I spoke. Set your phones to wake you up during the night. Do a quick check of your campers and the area around the cabins. We need to be vigilant, the others agreed, and we set a basic schedule for the nights. The next day, we were given our cabin assignments, and I was back in with the 10-year-olds. Fortunately, I also had a co-counselor, a guy named Scott with an absolutely ripped body. Imagine Chris Hemsworth, but bigger and yet one of the most gentle people I've ever met. Having him in the cabin provided two benefits. I personally felt safer to have a young Hercules sleeping a few feet from me, and with this being just his 3rd week at camp, he had energy to make up for what I was lacking. The first night, my phone woke me up at 4 a.m. I got up and checked on each of my campers. They were all present and accounted for. I stepped outside and walked through the area, looking for any activity. Nothing. I went back to bed and then repeated the same thing the next night. Again, nothing. Come Tuesday, no one in our group. I really wanted to call us Dumbledore's army, but there was no way they'd go along with it had witnessed anything. I felt a bit better, though it was like going to the doctor and hearing, well, I don't see anything wrong here. No demonic activity for 2 nights didn't mean it was over for good. As I was leaving dinner, Jordan came up to me. I'm ready. Tonight, 3 a.m. Meet at the bathroom. We'll walk over together. Bring a flashlight and your Bible. Despite my nervousness, I was still able to fall asleep pretty easily. The exhaustion that comes with this job is the ultimate insomnia killer. I woke up at 2:50, got dressed and grabbed my Bible and flashlight. I took a deep breath and walked outside. Jordan and a few other male staff were waiting for me. Once we were all together, we headed for the burnt place. The trip this time was significantly easier than the last. Having a group of 6 people to travel through the dark woods took away a lot of the fear, and we reached the burnt place in just a few minutes. As we arrived, I could see the girls coming down their respective path. Once we were all together, Jordan gave us our instructions. We were to stand around the debris and read out Bible verses, and then he would pray and expel the demon for good. I hesitantly took my place and flipped through my Bible to find what he wanted me to read. It all seemed too easy. Also, there was no smell of sulfur in the area, nor any of signs of a demonic presence, such as the Coles Kyle and I had found. But then again, maybe a demon didn't have to be physically present in order to be expelled. Maybe that was for the better. Once we were all in position, we went around in a circle, each of us reading out the passages Jordan had given us. When it was my turn, I loudly read out, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father, but by me. Then it moved on to the next person. When we were all done, Jordan raised his hands over the wreckage and in a loud voice said, O Lord, in your name, we cast this demon out from this place. We are on sacred ground and evil is not welcome, nor does it have any place here. In the name of Jesus Christ, we cast all demons out. I waited to see if anything would happen. I'm not sure if I was expecting a sudden flash of light or a big explosion, but when the only thing I heard was a few branches moving deep in the forest, it felt a little underwhelming. Had this ritual even worked? Or was there no way to tell? Jordan finally lowered his hands. There, he said confidently. It's done. Let's go. I really wanted to ask if that was it, but beyond a few murmurs of amen, no one said anything. I closed my Bible and walked back in silence with the rest of the guys. We said good night and went back into our cabins. As I climbed back into my bunk, I really wanted to believe that what we had done had worked. But there was something about it that was too easy. I know this wasn't a movie or some horror story, but shouldn't there have been more to it than some Bible readings and a quick prayer? Nothing seemed different that morning, nor during the day. No campers had gone missing or were disturbed by something, and the day seemed a bit sunnier. More than a few times, I exchanged looks with the others who had been at the burnt place, as if to ask if it really was over. Maybe? It was hard to know. That night, my phone woke me up at 4 a.m. I'd forgotten to turn the alarm off. I was about to roll over and go back to sleep when my nose caught the all-too-familiar scent. I pushed myself out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and walked outside. The overcast sky gave me very little light, and I had to rely on my flashlight to see anything. I walked around the cabins, shining my light around to look for anyone, ever aware of the burning sensation in my nostrils. I didn't see any movement, though as I approached the center of the cabins, I saw flickers of light. I cautiously walked out from around the wall and saw that a small fire was burning in the pit. No one was around it. What now? I muttered to myself. I went into Jordan's cabin and stirred him awake. He looked at his clock, then back at me, and then got out of bed without a word. I brought him out to the fire. He stared at it for a second and then took a step back. "Did you just find this here?" he asked. "Like right now." I told him I did. "Look at the sticks. That's not a normal fire." I took another look. It wasn't a normal fire, with logs propped on top of each other. Instead, a bunch of sticks and branches had been laid out in some sort of pattern and set alight. I walked around the pit, trying to figure out the pattern. And then it hit me. It's a pentagram. Jordan was biting hard on his lip, probably trying his best not to swear. It wants us to know that it's still here. He turned and walked back to his cabin. A few seconds later, I heard him curse loudly and then shout for me. I ran back to his cabin and found him staring at it. "Your flashlight," he said breathlessly, pointing at the wall. I aimed the beam at it. A string of obscenities I really hope no campers were awake at that point poured out of my mouth. A claw mark, the same as the one on the girls' cabins, had been burned into the wall next to the door. I ran back to my cabin and found the same. This couldn't be a coincidence. I checked the cabins of the other staff who had joined us at the ritual and found that they alone, had the marks as well. I met Jordan back at the fire pit as he poured water over the flames and broke the pentagram with his foot. He looked up at me with narrow, angry eyes. "Well, fuck. Come breakfast, the marks on the cabins were all anyone's staff or camper were talking about. The girls' cabins had been hit as well, but only the ones of staff who had been at the burnt place the previous night. Of course, we didn't reveal this to anyone. As far as the rest of Yaniwana was concerned, the cabins had been hit randomly. And fortunately for us, the sulfuric smell had disappeared by the time everyone else woke up. At the end of breakfast, Beth stood up in front of everyone and reiterated that the claws were a stupid prank, and that if anyone knew anything about expensive damage to camp property, they should report it to a staff member. Donald was conspicuously absent from breakfast, and when I asked Beth about it, she said he had been feeling sick and was resting in his cabin. I could barely focus while teaching rock climbing, which led to a camper nearly falling from the wall. Jordan's plan hadn't worked, and now each of us who had been involved with the ritual were being targeted by whatever this thing was. Had we made it angry? Were campers now in even more danger? I had to do something, but what? At the start of the summer, I didn't even believe in demons, and now I had to protect a whole bunch of kids from one. No, that wasn't right. It wasn't my responsibility to protect these kids. It was Donald's, and he was seriously neglecting it. He obviously knew something and was keeping it from the rest of us, which meant I had to confront him, put all the cards on the table and let him know what I knew, and why I felt the camp was in serious danger. As I came back from rock climbing, I stopped at Donald's cabin and knocked on the door. No response. I knocked again, this time harder. Still nothing. I thought I could hear movement inside, but if anyone was in there, they sure didn't want to answer. Donald wasn't at any of the meals or activities for the rest of the day, and what a long day it was. I kept looking over my shoulder, as though I was expecting some demonic entity to suddenly appear among the kids, and I noticed Jordan and the other Burnt Place staff doing the same thing. We were all super on edge. That night, as Scott and I worked to get the campers into bed, there was a knock on the front of the cabin. One of the other counselors poked his head in. "Hey, Donald wants to see you in his cabin." A chorus of "oh-oo" is erupted from my campers. I looked at Scott, who nodded, and then I put my shoes on and started towards Donald's cabin. My mind was racing. Why did he suddenly want to talk to me now? I reached his cabin and knocked. A voice shouted for me to come in. I opened a door and found Donald, sitting on his bed. He smiled as I came in and motioned for me to take a seat. "I hear you've been looking for me," he said. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaking. I had gone over this conversation in my head a dozen times during the day, but now, sitting in front of him, I'd forgotten everything I wanted to say. "No, I was actually looking for you a few nights ago," he said. "I woke up in the middle of the night on Tuesday and wanted to make sure you were okay, with everything that's happened. So I went to your cabin, and you weren't there." He didn't seem angry, more concerned than anything else. I sighed. No sense in lying about it. I was at the Burnt Place. His mouth twitched slightly. I went on, explaining the ritual we had performed, and then the sulfur, fire, and claw marks that happened last night. I must have gone on for a good 5 minutes, and by the end, my hands were shaking. "I'm really, really scared about this camp. I think something evil is attacking it." Donald rose from his bed, opened his fridge, and threw me a bottle of water. "Here, drink. I don't trust the water here. The pipes, they're very old." "Oh. Okay." I opened the bottle and took a few gulps. "But don't drink all of it," he continued. "You might want to save some of it for later." My eyes went to the rosary, once again hanging over the fridge. What was he saying, or more so, not saying? I decided to ask him just that. "Do you know something I don't?" No, that wasn't the question. "Do you think the camp is being attacked by a demon?" He sat back on the bunk. "You ever read C.S. Lewis?" he asked. Chronicles of Narnia and whatnot. He also wrote the Screwtape Letters, and there's a great quote in it about demons. Basically, there are two equal and opposite errors we can make about demons. We can disbelieve in their existence, or we can believe and be obsessed with them. And Lewis writes that they themselves are equally pleased by both errors. He looked right at me. Honestly, I think there is an explanation for all of this. But if it is a demon, I promise you that the camp is prepared. These campers are my responsibility, and I'm not going to let them get in harm's way. That was probably the best I was going to get out of him. If he admitted that there really was a demon, he'd have to explain why he was allowing the camp to remain open. Also, he'd look insane. I thanked him, grabbed the water, and stepped outside. I simultaneously felt both reassured and anxious, though I guess that was to be expected given Donald's ambiguity. From the front of his cabin, I looked over into the forest. Whatever was happening there, all I had to do was keep the campers safe for another 9 days. I could do that. I had to. I was about to head back to my cabin when I saw a flicker of light within the forest. I walked up to the edge of the trees and tried to get a better view. It was hard to see so many trees in there, but it looked like a light was coming from deep in the woods. And it was moving towards me. Was someone coming from the burnt place? The way the light flickered, it didn't look like a flashlight, it was more like a flame or a torch. I felt drawn to it. I stepped into the path in the forest and started walking towards the light, feeling a mixture of curiosity and fear. I'd gone about 100 feet in when the light suddenly vanished. I waited in place for a minute, listening for any sounds of movement, but I didn't hear anything. I rubbed my head and sighed. I really needed to get some rest. I turned around and I saw it. The hooded figure hovered right in front of me, its massive cloaked body towering over me. I stared at it in shock, feeling my whole body go numb. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some waking hallucination. This was real. From the black void in its hood came sparks that turned into a flame, burning just inside the ratty dark fabric. It looked down at me, as though there were eyes in that fire, and then it said my name. Or more, I heard my name in a harsh whisper, echoing all around me. Its arms raised up and the talons emerged, coming just inches from my face. The shock wore off and my body started to shake. I tried to get some words out, a prayer, a scream, anything, but all I could get out were a few stutters. Confess, the word echoed around me. The fire in the hood seemed to burn brighter. See, confess, I found a way to get the word out. Your sin, 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 what sins? It was taking all of my strength to not fall to my knees. I cheated on my chem test, and your sin. My body felt hot, but I could feel Jordan's cool cross on my chest. I put my hand against it. What are you? I asked. What do you want? The talons moved apart, so that they were above either side of my head. Confess, it said again. Your sin, sin, singular. My knees buckled again. I knew what it wanted me to say. I narrowed my eyes in both fear and anger. You leave this camp alone. These campers too, what did Jordan say? In Jesus' name I confess. There was fire all around me. Every tree, every branch, everything. Burning. Please no. I collapsed to my knees. I could feel this thing peering right into my soul, trying to destroy it. I'm sorry. Oh God, I'm sorry, your sin. Tears fell from my face. I'm sorry. I did it. I know I did it, and I confessed. I told that thing what I had done, what I knew it was trying to extract from me. I don't want to repeat it here, but some of you may remember that in my first year, I got into some trouble for an incident that took place in my residence. I've always claimed that I was too drunk to know what was happening, and I was believed, but truthfully, I was just tipsy. I knew what I was doing, and I have never forgotten it. I told the figure, the demon, as much. I was a blubbering mess by the end, on my hands and knees, my face just a foot from the ground, sobbing. I said how sorry I was over and over. I begged it for forgiveness. Finally, I looked up at the thing. It still stood there, flame burning, its talons raised up. You are not forgiven. I have never been as scared in my life as I was that moment. I was sure I was about to die. I brought my arms up to defend myself, and I realized I still had the bottle of water Donald had given me. He had told me to save it. Was it for this? I twisted the cap off and sprayed it at the figure. There was a loud, reverberating hiss all around me, like 1,000 snakes, and then the figure and the flames were gone, and I was alone in the dark woods. I fell back onto my hands and vomited. Camp food does not taste as good the second time around. I'm not sure how long I stayed in that forest, but eventually I got up, and stumbled out. I passed Donald's cabin, now dark, and kept moving until I reached the boys' section. My head spinning, I found Jordan's cabin and walked right in. His campers were asleep, but he was still up, reading in his bunk. "Please," I gasped, "pray for me." He came outside, put an arm around me, and prayed for a good 30 minutes. Afterwards, I hugged him tightly and went back to my bed. I honestly can't remember how long I laid there before I fell asleep. The next day, yesterday, I was an absolute wreck. I'm sure it showed, but I didn't care. I got through the meals, rock climbing, the games, and the end-of-week goodbyes, all pretty much on autopilot. I saw Donald just once at lunch, but all I could do was look at him from afar. What does he know? Today, as I sit in this bright little park, writing this to all of you, I'm feeling a bit better. I mean, I encountered a demon and survived. That's a positive, right? And now my task is clear. Protect Yaniwana, at all costs, for the final week ahead. I have no idea who I can trust or what I can do, if anything, to stop this thing, but I am going to try. I have to. Pray for me. About an hour later, I received this message from him. Holy shit. I didn't realize it before I sent this week's update, but there was an email in my inbox from Kate. It's long, really long, but from skimming over it, I don't even know what to say. It changes everything. I think I might have a chance. I am writing this out on my phone as I sit in the back of a car, coming back to civilization. This week was absolute fucking nuts, and I'm going to do my best to write as much as I can for now, but I already know that I won't be able to share everything right now. So I'll stop when I feel like I've had enough, and will send you the remaining part when I've had some time to process all of this. Also, seeing that some of you have been sharing this online, more on that in a minute. Please add content warnings for this and the next part. It's pretty bad. I'm not sure how the last week of a summer camp is supposed to be, but I'd imagine it's not as tense as things were at Yaniwana on Sunday. Yes, everyone was tired, and the sense of summer ending and school beginning again is palpable. But man, you could cut the tension with a knife. At our standard church service, it felt like no one had any excitement for the music, and these are people who love to jump and clap to any song that mentions God. And then at lunch, there was very little chatter amongst the counselors. Just lots of eating. At the end, Donald took to the microphone. He told us to keep the energy levels up for the last week of Campers Not Likely, and went through a few housekeeping items about finishing up at camp and going home. Then his tone dropped. I know this summer has had its share of adventure and excitement. Please spend this final week being safe and making sure all the kids here are cared for. And I want to be crystal clear on this. No one is to go in or around the old wilderness shed. That means none of the forest surrounding it. It is not a safe place, and once the summer is over, we're going to look at how to get rid of it. At the time, it felt like the closest he'd ever come to a tacit admission that the burnt place, and whatever was haunting it, needed to be removed from camp for good. It was a tiny bit reassuring. I, however, was still a wreck. My encounter on Thursday was still hanging in my mind, and I didn't need any further instructions from Donald to tell me to avoid whatever thing had come at me. I kept thinking back to how I had escaped, the bottle of water Donald had given me. He had to have known what it would do. But more than that, what if I hadn't had it with me? What would have happened to me then? The thing had said that I was not forgiven. What would that judgment have entailed? These questions swirled in my head, but I was able to push them aside with a singular focus on one thing: protecting the camp. My nights were sleepless, and I was waking up every few hours, but that was fine. It meant I could get up, look around for any giant robed figures or anyone helping them, ensure that my own campers were okay, and then go back to bed feeling a little bit better. I didn't trust anyone else to do it, especially anyone from the 10 of us who had been at the burnt place the previous week. Given that all of us were subsequently targeted with the burn marks on our tabans, there was a real possibility of a turncoat, a Judas, if you will, within that group. That even included Jordan, as much as I wanted to lean on him. I could only trust myself. During the day, I was always on alert, as if I were waiting for the robed figure to emerge from behind a tree or appear in the middle of the field. There was also the terrifyingly real threat that he could do other kinds of evil in the camp. It made me thankful to be at the rock wall, where I could keep an eagle eye out for any fraying ropes or loose carabiners. Unfortunately, the fitful nights and intense days led me to a point of total exhaustion, and halfway through Wednesday, I began to feel dizzy. A few hours later, I collapsed and started vomiting. The nurse chalked it up to a combination of heat stroke and fatigue, and I was bedridden for the next 2 days. Honestly, it was almost for the better. I slept in half-day increments, giving me little time to worry about what was going on outside my cabin. The other counselors were really good about taking on my final group of boys, and in my brief waking moments, I figured to myself that enough of them had to be capable of protecting the kids. And then I'd go back to sleep. I woke up Friday morning feeling about 60%, which for the final day of camp is the equivalent of 150%. I taught my last rock climbing course and watched as 3 kids bested the overhang, and then in the afternoon, we had the final game of Capture the Flag of the summer. And thanks to my renewed energy, I was able to run the flag back to win us the game. I know it's not the most important detail, but it was the first time I won anything at camp. It felt good. I had mixed feelings as dinner rolled around, and we gorged on roast beef and mashed potatoes. The last dinner of each week was always something pretty great. On one hand, yes, I was glad the summer was ending, and I was going to get as far away from this place as possible. On the other, damn it, if I didn't feel like this summer had been something special. Demons and the weird shit aside, I got to spend 8 weeks hanging out with some awesome kids and be a role model and whatnot for them. I would honestly miss watching the kids reach the top of the rock wall for the first time, or playing around with them in the lake, or the late-night discussions we'd have, even if they tended to spiral into silliness. Yaniwana was a weird place, but I was going to miss it. Or at least, parts of it. After dinner, Donald approached me and asked if I'd come back to his cabin. He promised it would be brief. I followed him there and once again sat in the chair while he took the bed. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "A lot better," I said. "The resting was what I needed. Sucks that I missed the last few days here, though," he laughed. "I'm glad you had fun today, at least." He leaned forward. "Anyway, I just wanted to quickly say thanks for everything you did this summer. I know that there was a lot that went on, but you handled it like a champ. Especially for a first-time counselor, too. I hope you enjoyed being up here, all things considered," I chuckled. "It was memorable, that's for sure. Well, thanks again. If I don't see you, safe travels home and best of luck at school this year." "Thanks," I said. I got up from my chair and was about to leave when the rosary, still hanging above the mini-fridge, caught my eye. "Hey, could I get a bottle of water?" What the hell, right? At worst, it would keep me hydrated, and at best it would give me one more weapon for the final night. He cocked an eyebrow. "You bet." He grabbed one from the fridge and tossed it to me. "Have a good last night here. You too." I left and headed back to the cabin. There was one last campfire, and I have to admit that I teared up a bit as a few of the counselors sung a song about God and stars and sang goodbye, and then we watched as they extinguished the fire for the final time of 2019. My campers were, thankfully, pretty exhausted from the day and were quick to get into their beds and fall asleep. I, on the other hand, was not as inclined. I laid in my bunk, staring up at the dark ceiling, my mind spinning. I had made it. I was at the finish line. I had survived the summer. And yet, all the questions about what was going on here still swirled in my mind. And exacerbating all of them was Kate's email. Right, I suppose I should tell you about her email. It was long, like easily 5,000 words, and it took me several sittings just to go through all of it, and then several more to go over it again. And again. I'd copy and paste it, but I don't want to make your inbox crash when you get this. But she started by apologizing for not reaching out to me earlier and for hanging up when I'd called her a few weeks ago. She had been in a bad place, and my late-night call hadn't done much to help. In fact, she wasn't sure about emailing me until a friend notified her about a story on Reddit that seems to be about you, apparently one of you looking at you. Drew has been posting this online for the record. I'm okay with this. But if it's ever published, I want a cut. Kate saw it and realized she had to contact me to let me know what had happened with her disappearance, though she also said she was glad to have an excuse. She then revealed to me something she had wanted to ever since I met her, but was too ashamed to. Last year, Kate's older sister had been killed in a gruesome car crash. Kate had gone into a deep depression afterwards and had started cutting herself. I had noticed some scars on her wrists when I met her, but I didn't feel like that was something to share with all of you. She'd also had nightmares where she was stalked by a large demon with twisted horns and glowing red eyes. She'd avoided going to Yaniwana last year. The memories of going back to a camp where she and her sister had spent so many summers together were too much, but thought that she'd be able to handle herself this year. And she had. Until I mentioned seeing the robed figure for the first time. That, she wrote, was like a switch snapping in her head. All she could think about was the demon of her own nightmares, which she associated with her sister's death. And that led to all the memories of camp with her sister flooding back to her. I'll quote her for this next part, because I can't recap it any better. I guess I had been suppressing so many of these memories, and so much pain, because it just kept crashing over me. That last day I saw you, when I didn't speak to you, it was because I was afraid I would just break down then and there, and I didn't want you to see me like that. Then that night, I was just so overwhelmed and scared and angry, and so I went out behind the cabins and cut myself. It felt relieving for like 5 seconds before I realized what I had done. I was so ashamed of myself because I had been good for over a year. I remember running into the forest and just falling to the ground and crying. Some of the other counselors found me, and we stayed up all night talking. And then I called my parents at like 3 a.m., and they came and picked me up. I want you to know that I don't blame you at all for what happened, and I'm really sorry I never told you about this, or that I didn't say goodbye. I really wish I had. But I do have some news. I'm going to be going to U of Windsor in the fall. I know it's not super close to Guelph, but there is a via train. If you're up for it, I'd love to grab a coffee or maybe something stronger once we've settled in. I feel like I owe you that much. The email had given me a ton of mixed feelings. I was really, really glad that she was okay and that there was a reasonable explanation behind what had happened. And the fact that she wanted to go on a date was pretty sweet. But I also felt terrible for her to have kept all her emotions bottled up, and the fact that I had been the one to trigger her put this heavy weight on my chest. I tried to tell myself that there was nothing I could have done, that hell, she didn't even blame me. But looking back on it, I just wish I'd somehow known then what I know now. And then there was the bigger issue at play. Her email did nothing to get me closer to all the weird shit that had happened in the weeks after she disappeared. The fact that I now knew why I had seen her running that night, why I'd heard the scream, and why I found blood on the trail afterward. None of it explained the missing campers or the weird occurrences at the burnt place, or the claw marks, or the sulfur, or the cabin catching on fire. It was a coincidence, not an explanation. Lying in my bunk on that Friday night, I sighed at the thought. It was frustrating. I felt like I was completing a puzzle, the kind with no picture on the box, and even though I'd been able to put together a small section, I still couldn't tell what the image was. But I would be going home in 12 hours. What more could I do? I needed a drink. But since still had a day before I'd be able to drink a beer, I rolled over and grabbed Donald's water bottle from the ledge. It was still full, and I figured I could have a bit and use whatever remained to fight off the demon if I needed to. I opened it and took a swig. And as the water swished in my mouth, I froze, letting it just sit there. My mind was racing again. If it wasn't putting the puzzle pieces together, at least looking at them from a different angle. It was Kate's disappearance and me thinking I'd seen something otherworldly that night that had led me to the burnt place originally. And now that I had a rational explanation for it, could there be the same thing for everything else that had happened? Was that possible? I went over every bizarre thing that had happened since I came up 8 weeks earlier. The whole time, I had thought that something otherworldly was going on here. Something supernatural and devastating. A demon. But a camper much braver and smarter than me was confident that if demons did exist, they were not stronger than a god who had to exist as well. I finally swallowed the water and then sighed and shook my head. I already knew what this was leading to. I had made a promise to Ian that I would protect the camp. I was going to leave, but in 10 months there would once again be kids here. Smelly, loud, annoying, bed-wetting, sleep-ruining, energy-draining kids who I nevertheless cared deeply about. Loved even. I owed it to them to figure this thing out. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. There was only one thing I could do now. I had to go back to the burnt place. Sorry to keep you all waiting. These last few days have been beyond crazy. I've either been sleeping, doing interviews, or sitting on my bed, curled up in the fetal position, rocking back and forth. That last one is a joke. Sort of. Honestly, I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to share all of this with you, especially since one of you has been posting this on Reddit, though I guess you can say it's all fiction. Drew. It's just nice to be typing this on a computer instead of my phone. Before I finish this story, thanks to all of you for keeping me sane this summer. Being able to share all this chaos with you is really helpful, and I appreciate all the supportive emails you sent me back. I'm obviously never returning to Yaniwana, or probably any summer camp ever again, but oh boy was this summer life-changing. Anyway, I'm sure you're all dying to find out what happened, so here goes. It was around midnight on Friday as I left the cabin, flashlight in one hand and bottle of holy water in the other. For what felt like the 10th time that summer, I crossed the darkened field, past Donald's cabin, and went behind the lodge. At this point, I had gone into the hidden path so many times, it may as well have been illuminated with neon arrows. I stopped in front of it, took a deep breath, swished the water around in the bottle, and headed in. The smell hit me within 30 seconds. I tried my best to think nothing of it, and pressed on. I passed the spot where I had had my encounter the week before the bits of my remaining vomit gave it away. A little bit further, I walked around the corner where we had found Nathan, curled up and barely able to speak. Another minute of walking, and I went past the area where Jordan and I had done our impromptu prayer or hymn session. The sulfuric stench was strong as ever as I reached the final stretch of the path. So far, I hadn't seen or heard anything. No snapping branches, no guttural screams, no fire or flames. I wanted to relax, but I reminded myself that it had been the same way when the 10 of us had tried to drive the demon out, and it turned out we hadn't been alone after all. I made it to the end and walked out into the clearing. It was another cloudy night, giving me very little visibility without my flashlight. I swept the beam across the trees around me. I'm not sure what I was looking for. Maybe just reassurance that I was alone, and then focused it on the rubble in the middle. How many times had I heard that it was cursed? Demonic? A portal to hell? And yet, for all the times I'd been here, I'd never actually gone into it. I circled the debris, trying to find the best way through. It was strange how all of the metal and wood was positioned so that there were no openings to the empty center in the middle, nor could anyone try climbing over without getting seriously cut up. Very strange. I regretted not wearing long sleeves, which may have made it a bit easier to climb, and considered going back to my cabin to get a sweater and jeans. But as I went around again, looking for any sort of way in, I noticed that a small section of the rubble seemed to be shaking slightly. There was a breeze going through the trees, but nothing that would cause hundreds of pounds of junk to move. I approached it, grabbed a piece of metal that was jutting out, and shook it myself. The section about 3 feet of the rubble moved back and forth by about an inch. I could hear it banging against the other parts, as though it were. A gate, I said aloud, and every gate needed a latch. I shone my light along the section, looking for just that. It took me a few minutes, but I found it on the inside of the rubble, half concealed by a piece of rotting wood. I flicked it open and pushed on the metal. It swung inward. It was bizarre, to say the least, to see this big hunk of steel and lumber basically floating above the ground. I could see the big rusty hinges from which it connected to the rest of the wall of debris, as well as the steel beams that the junk had been attached to make this hidden gate. I narrowed my eyes as I walked through the new opening. Who had made this? And why? I was afraid I already knew the answer. I was now standing in the middle of the burnt place. My feet moved through the ash and dust as I shone my flashlight on the ground, looking for any further clues to its mystery. For a few minutes, I couldn't find anything. It was all just a lot of black ground and dirt. I didn't stop. There was no way I could come this far and not have more to discover. As I paced the area for the 3rd time, I noticed my footing suddenly change at one of the far ends. It went from hard and slippery to soft and rubbery. I crouched down and examined it, both with my flashlight and my hands. It was a square, about 3 feet on each side, made of some synthetic material, but on level with the rest of the ground and covered in a thin layer of ash. It would have been impossible to find if you hadn't been looking for it. So what was it for? As I moved my hands along the edges, I found a slight hole in the ground. I shone my light in it. Under the material, about an inch from the edge, was a handle and a combination lock. I tried the handle. The square lifted slightly, and then was caught by the lock. There was a crack in the woods behind me. I looked back for a few seconds before returning to the lock. It was slightly obscured, but I could see it was a standard spinning lock, the kind I'd cracked a few times when pulling pranks in high school. I'd learned how to tell when the lock had hit the right number. Could I do it again? It wasn't like I had any other choice. I reached down and began to spin it to the right slowly. After about a turn and a half, I felt it give a little resistance. Good. Now the other way. 2 turns and I didn't feel anything. I had to try again. And again. On my 5th attempt, I heard a satisfying click and felt the lock come open in my hand. I pulled it from the latches and put it in my pocket. Then I grabbed the handle and yanked it up. It opened with surprising ease, revealing a set of stairs leading into a large hole in the ground. I took a second to just gaze down it. What the fuck? There was nowhere to go but down. I shone my flashlight into the hole and slowly walked down the steep steps. The hatch closed above me, aided by a pneumatic hinge that slowed its closing. I went deeper down, my flashlight the only illumination. What was this place? An old bomb shelter? A secret hideout? I reached the bottom and shone my light around. It was a small room, about the same size as a cabin, with concrete walls and a metal ceiling. To my right was a twin bed with a single sheet and metal frames at both the head and foot. Attached to the frames were leather cuffs with buckles. On the wall above the bed were several posters: Transformers, Star Wars, and Avengers. Along the back wall were more chains and straps, hanging from pegs. I examined them and then looked back at the bed. Was someone coming down here to do some kinky sex or BDSM? I briefly considered that maybe Yaniwana was actually a front for a sex cult, and this was where it all went down. But I knew it wasn't the explanation. I feared I already knew what the real one was. My fears were amplified as I turned to the wall on my left, opposite the bed. A large wooden chest sat against it, with a tall camera tripod next to it. I felt my breath go short. I lifted open the chest with a shaking hand and looked in. The first thing I saw was a large metal rod with a separate piece at one end. I picked it up and looked it over. The metal piece was a massive, multi-taloned claw. A branding iron. It was a branding iron. I put it back and looked over the several jars of white powder sitting in one of the back corners. From where I was, and even with the jars closed, I could smell the burning sulfuric scent coming from them. There were also some garments of clothing. I pulled them out. A Boy Scout uniform, a girl's pink dress, a miniature sailor suit. Shit. I was about to put the costumes back when I saw a small black box that had been underneath them. I pulled it out and opened it. A video camera was inside. Fuck. I already knew what was on the camera. There was no doubt in my mind. But I had to see. I had to know. I flipped out the camera's little screen and found the recorded videos. I took a deep breath, gritted my teeth, and hit play on the first one. Within 10 seconds, I'd closed the screen and had to resist throwing the camera across the room. I forced myself to keep watching. I was now a witness. It was exactly what I thought, and yet worse than I could imagine. There were about 20 videos on that camera, and I watched a few seconds of each. I had to know what campers Donald had abused. Nathan, Kyle's camper who had gone missing, he was there. Now I understood why he had been inconsolable when we'd found him. I recognized several more campers from rock climbing. I remembered one of them had become extremely homesick halfway through the week. Was this the reason? And each of the other kids, both boys and girls, I was sure I'd seen at some point during the summer. These had all been made in the last 2 months. Jesus. I hate to admit it, but I felt a tiny bit of relief when I didn't recognize any of the campers who had been in my cabin, especially Adam. I felt a chill go down my spine as I realized that we had probably saved him when we found him lying on the grass. Thank fucking God. Too bad I couldn't say the same for the rest of these kids. When I'd finished going through the videos, I stumbled back and sat on the bed as tears formed in my eyes. My God. This is what had happened at the camp, right under my nose. Those poor kids. At the end of the only video I watched all the way through, after he had, and I'll just fucking say it, raped a girl, Donald looked at her and said that if she told anyone, he'd share the video with her family and everyone in her school. I thought back to the first night I'd been with my campers, how they'd all agreed that their biggest fear was an embarrassing video of them going viral. Donald had threatened them with something 1,000,000 times worse. No wonder they had kept quiet. I wiped away my tears and looked at the camera in my hand. I took a deep breath and felt my skin get hot. That piece of shit. That monster. I had to make him pay. And I would. I fucking would. The hatch at the top of the stairs suddenly opened. It had to be him. I moved to the other wall and pushed my body up against the corner, close to the staircase. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, followed by a flick as several ceiling lights came on. I had missed that on my way in. Donald emerged and looked around, spotting me. He snorted. I should have guessed the rage that filled me as I stared at him, knowing what he had done, was stronger than anything I'd felt in my life. "Fuck you," was all I could breathe out. He looked at the open chest, and then at the camera in my hand. "So you know then. I thought I'd had scared you away. Guess I should have resorted to more drastic measures." A psychopath. He was a complete psychopath, talking about this like it was some sort of game. "You're dead," I seethed out. "You're going to die in prison." For a brief moment, he seemed to show a twinge of concern, but he immediately recovered. "If that's the road you want to go down, you're welcome to try." This wasn't the Donald I had spent the last 8 weeks with. No, this guy, the real Donald, was calculating and sinister. Evil. "But perhaps you and I can come to an arrangement." He paused, as though he were waiting for me to say something. I stayed silent. I know how expensive university is these days. "I'm sure I could help you." Shut up. I couldn't contain myself anymore. "You living piece of shit. You fucker. I saw those videos. I saw what you did to them. And you think you could pay me?" I could feel my blood boiling in my veins. "It's over. You are done. I am going to end this right now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sizable switchblade. Like I said, you're welcome to try. In retrospect, it was almost funny. Him threatening my life, as though it would do anything to put me off. At that moment, in that underground room, he was scared and I was angry. And it turns out that when it comes to fear versus anger, anger is a hell of a lot more powerful. I grabbed the nearby tripod with my free hand and swung it at him. He was able to block it with his arm, but not the second, third, or fourth ones. I connected the final swing to the side of his head, and he went down to his knees. I threw the tripod aside and started pummeling him with my fists. Some of you may remember that I played AAA hockey in high school and had a bit of a temper on the ice. That temper came roaring back as I hit him over and over, until his face was covered with bruises and blood. All I could think about was those kids and what he had done to them. With every punch, I felt a tiny bit of justice. He deserved it. Eventually, when I had reached a point where I was afraid I was close to killing him, I stopped hitting him and instead pushed him back and onto the bed. I tied the leather straps around his hands as tightly as I could. As I did, he coughed out a laugh and muttered something, though I couldn't tell with all the blood gurgling in his mouth. "You think this is all a game?" I spat. "Well, you lost. And you know what, Donald? It's your own fault. Next time you give someone hallucinogens in a water bottle, seal the bottle up again. Otherwise, he'll notice when he twists open the next one you give him." I turned to leave, but he coughed out. I looked back at him. His blood-soaked lips were smiling. "Fuck you." I raised my fists up and pounded them into his chest. I felt several cracks beneath my hands. He let out several short, pained wheezes. I spat at him, and then went up the stairs, shutting off the lights as I passed the switch. I pushed the hatch open and climbed out. Once the hatch had closed, I fished the lock back out of my pocket and put it through the latches. Donald wasn't going anywhere. The camera was still in my hand, and though it was covered in blood, it seemed to work. I'd left my flashlight in the bunker, so the walk back through the path wasn't easy, but I didn't let up, no matter how branches I took to the face. I reached the lodge, broke into the med center with a hard push to the door, and called the cops. I told them that I was at Camp Yaniwana, and I had evidence of child abuse and the creation of child pornography. Then I sat on the lodge's steps and waited. As much as I wanted to show Beth or Smokey, I didn't know who I could trust. Only one car initially arrived, around 1 in the morning. I explained to them what I had seen and showed them the videos on the camera. An hour later, there were a dozen cars in the parking lot with both OP and RCMP officers walking around the grounds. I watched as a team of them went down the path towards the burnt place, guns raised, and then I turned around and saw Beth and Smokey talking to several officers. Beth had covered her hands over her face and was crouched down, crying. I felt a huge amount of sadness for her. If she'd had no idea about it, and it sure seemed like this was a surprise to her, how would she ever be able to forgive herself? After someone took my statement, I was told I could go back to my cabin. I gave Beth a sympathetic look and walked away. In the washroom, I cleaned the blood off of my hands and face, and then I went back to my bunk. I sat down on it and looked around the room at each of my campers. Despite what I had seen, despite the truth I now knew about this camp, I felt a sense of relief. I'd solved the mystery. I'd stopped Donald. Good. I stayed sitting on my bed for God knows how long, and at some point must have I drifted off, because I suddenly found myself lying in my bed with the cloaked figure standing above me, its endless black face staring right into my eyes. I was scared for the first few seconds, as always, but then my wits returned to me. This was a vision. It wasn't real. It never had been. No, I whispered. And then it was gone. I rolled over and went back to sleep. Morning arrived soon after, and I was surprised to find not a single police car or officer around as we lined up at the mess hall. For a moment, a terrifying moment, I wondered if I had dreamt everything. But when I saw the tread marks from all the cars on the gravel road, combined with a tired, distraught Beth at breakfast, I knew that it had all been real. When we had finished eating, Beth took to the microphone. She looked like a wreck, with dark circles under her puffy red eyes. Her voice was low and raspy. I just want to thank you all for a great week. And counselors, thank you for a great summer. There was cheering and applause. It was surreal. They had no idea what had just happened. This camp is a special place, isn't it? And I hope that it remains a special place where good memories are made for a long time. How does that sound? More cheering. I hoped the same thing, but I knew that it wasn't true for at least 20 kids. As campers and staff alike began to leave, I said my goodbyes and made promises to keep in touch. I gave Jordan a big hug and thanked him for his help. And I did a quick final walk of the area, the rock wall, the lake, the cabins, and then grabbed my bags and waited in the parking lot. Just after everyone had left, a black SUV pulled up and I got in. The two RCMP officers in the front asked me question after question as they drove me back home. And now I'm here. From what I've been told in the multiple interviews I've had with the Mounties child exploitation officers, Donald has been arrested and a forensics team has been going over Yaniwana with a fine-toothed comb. They've been locating and talking to each of the kids who were in the videos, and while they couldn't tell me a price, shit, it sounds bad. At some point, I'm probably going to be called in to testify against him. I can't fucking wait. In the meantime, I'm heading back to Guelph in a few days, and I'm already looking for a therapist, because God, am I going to need one. Hopefully, the start of classes will help me take my mind off of things, and if it doesn't, I have other things I need to do. Like make a trip to Hamilton to see a 14-year-old cancer survivor, or make myself available for a girl in Windsor who owes me a drink and a bit of an explanation. Honestly, there is a part of me that misses and will continue to miss Yaniwana. Beth, and so many other people I talked to, were right. Camp is a special place. And though I'm now back in civilization, with its cell reception and climate control and food varieties, I know that this experience is going to stay with me. And I do mean the full experience. I'm not going to need a therapist to work through the late-night conversations I had with my campers, or the joy I felt when I saw a kid reach the top of the rock wall, or the sheer fun of playing capture the flag or swimming in the freezing cold lake. I'm glad that I was able to protect that experience for future campers. I just wish I'd somehow figured it out sooner. One last thing. When I sent you the first email 2 months ago, I said that I wasn't sure about God and that I didn't believe in demons. And that has changed. I'm still not sure about God, but I absolutely believe in demons now. Because I met one. And I worked for him. And I trusted him. And I hope he burns in hell.